Hello, everybody.
Hello, Greg.
There.
How you doing, Kirk?
I'm good.
You're a big part of today's agenda.
Well, not as much as normal. There's a lot more stuff we're going to talk about today other than just how much money we've got and what we're going to do with the projects bill. So it's good. I think this will be a good conversation.
Good.
It's certainly an easier meeting in person, but I guess we're getting used to this.
We had a funny deal today. We had a commissioner meeting and then we were going into executive session. And then that was going to be the end of the day. There weren't going to be any decisions coming out of executive session. And I'm used to us leaving the one Zoom meeting, going into a different one for executive session and then coming back. And everybody who was in the executive session was actually in the room, but we were on Zoom from the regular meeting. And I said, okay, so we're going to go to the other Zoom room, so to speak. And everyone's like, no, we don't need to. And I go, well, yeah, because we want to make sure that nobody sneaks in or anything. And they're like, no, we'll just turn it off. And I'm like, what do you mean? You can't turn it off. And I realized that to me, it's gotten now where if I don't have Zoom on, it's not actually a meeting. I felt like we couldn't meet in person without also having my computer running the same damn thing. I'm losing it.
And you're not alone. We're all losing it. Except Director Schwartz. She's got it all under control. I see that.
I got multiple stations going here, ready to pull it up.
She's like a disc jockey. Working it.
The DJ. I wish.
How are you doing, Gail?
Good. Skies are clear. Weather is cool. We can't ask for much more.
Did you guys just get hammered last Monday?
Oh, Monday and Tuesday. Of course, I'm in the Banana Belt, but up in the mountains, plenty. And you?
I don't know why. But for some reason on Monday, we decided to go up to check out the top of Cottonwood Pass. You know, we saw this fantastic view of nothing, just totally socked in with smoke. But it was the smokiest day that anybody of any age could remember in Salida. Much worse than we ever had during the Decker fire.
Yeah. Oh, really? Really?
Yeah.
Didn't settle. Interesting.
It's really thick.
Oh, wow. We happened to be on the front range when that fire took off in Fort Collins.
Oh,
wow.
Man.
That was horrific.
And then did you get snow?
Tons.
Yeah. That was
awesome.
Weird. Choking one day and then pulling in all the vegetables the next
We
day.
needed that moisture to clear the air, didn't we?
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Well, we are in a very interesting time in our state, in our nation, in our climate. So we got some work to do.
That was an understatement. But I agree. Oh, my gosh.
All right, I'm starting to see some
How are we doing here?
Some friendly faces here, and I think I saw Madam Chair, Celine Hawkins. So I think that means we're able to launch this, right?
I think so. I am here. I can't see Heather, but she may be farther. There she is.
I think I saw Heather as well.
Hi.
I don't believe Becky will be joining us at the beginning of the meeting. I think she had an appointment with her daughter. She may either be listening in, but she said she was not going to be on the Zoom side of this.
Okay. And what about Steve? There he is. Okay. I think we're good.
All right, let's get going on this. And I thank you all for joining us this year. I want to walk through a couple things as we get started. This is the first time we've done a finance committee meeting on Zoom, and it's certainly a lot easier in person, like most of these meetings. And in the past, we've balanced the idea of it's not a board meeting, it's that idea of having this informal conversation and the decisions that are made. If they do require ultimate board decision, that they'll be at a later date. Most of the money decisions are handled in November. But I wanted to talk through, for some that are fairly new to the board, kind of why we have a finance committee meeting and why we do the things the way we do it. Certainly an evolution over the years. Back in about 2000, and I'll show you a timeline here in a little bit, back in the 2000 timeframe, late 1990s, we went through a performance audit at CWCB, and they dove deep into how we operate the loan program and how it generates revenue and what we do relative to the statute. And out of that came the policies. And at the time, the finance committee is where they chewed on a lot of those policy decisions, trying to take it out of the formal board action. And so over the years, at that time, it was, should the board, or who wants to be on the finance committee? I'll never forget in the July board meeting, there'd be a look around. Mike Serlette, who was the section chief at the time, would say, all right, who wants to be on the finance committee? And in the end, it was pretty much everybody wanted to know what was being done with the money, which made sense. And then once that got to that point, it was like, well, let's just have the finance committee meeting the day before the board meeting, since everybody's going to want to be there anyway and not have to make a special trip to gather, obviously long before Zoom meetings. And so now we get to the point where the finance committee meeting is somewhat of a workshop / committee meeting talking about finance. And for the most part in the past, it's been focused on the projects bill. The board has the authorization to do loans up to $10 million without legislative approval. And so anything that needed that non-reimbursable commitment by the board needed to go through the legislature. So this finance committee is what set up the process to get in front of the legislature with our requests for the projects bill. The next thing I wanted to point out is because of the nature of this meeting, and I will rely on Madam Chair to help guide some stuff that the board needs to chew on. But if it's okay, I think our presenters and certainly I will go through my stuff. And if anybody has a question, feel free to chime in. It might be easier to ask while we go, as opposed to the normal board presentation where we try to give it all to you and then manage questions afterwards. So I would like this to be as much interactive as we can, with the understanding that Zoom calls are complicated enough, let alone trying to talk over with questions. So with that, I'm going to jump to the agenda. If I know how to do that. Just to run through the current agenda as it is. And again, I hope we can move through this faster than 3.5 hours today, because I know you guys are all anticipating on another day and a half of this for the next 2. So first thing I'm going to do is run through just some history of the funds and where we are currently. And we're fortunate that Carly Jacobs has joined us. I think it's enormous value for the board to hear from Carly, from her seat in the DNR budget side, just to share with us what it looks like from her position overall with DNR. So we're fortunate that she'll be here for that. And then Anna and Russ will be talking about the idea of this spending plan and how we're managing funds going forward here in times of scarcity. Lauren Riss will be talking about this grant program work plan with the board. And then the non-reimbursable project investment applications, which is usually what dominates the finance committee meeting, is next. And then we've got a large project that we would like the board to talk through, and Heather Dutton's going to talk through some of that. And then number 7, the loan grant application portal. We're excited. Anna's been working hard getting this, getting us into the 21st century here with using the web for our grant processes. So she's got a presentation on that. I've got this miscellaneous in there really just as a catch-all in the event that there's something that either runs long, or if the board wants to talk more about something else. So with that, I'm going to jump in unless there is some question at this point. All right, so I'm gonna flip through some slides here. About every 3rd or 4th year, I have this timeline that I put together, and I think it always helps for a board like this to see where we've been, why, kind of the history of where things, where we have come from. And so I'm going to walk through some slides here. So we were created, the loan program was created in 1971. And this is important right now because we're going to celebrate 50 years next year. And we got to figure out how to celebrate that. So I'll be looking to you all to help me do that. So in 1974, we only approved 2 project loans, and they both were in the projects bill. And the interesting piece of this is everything that this board did at the time, whether it was non-reimbursable or loans, had to go to the projects bill. So the 1974 projects bill had 2 loans in it. We didn't have a lot of money. And so then in 76, we were up to 6 loans. Total of 3.2 million went out the door. We added flood control and recreational projects in 1978. In the 80s, the Water and Power Authority was created in 1981 with some seed money from the construction fund from CWCB. And then in 85, our equity value was about 100 million. Today, it's just around $1 billion. In the 90s, we've completed our 100th project. 95, we added, or the legislature added the Severance Tax Perpetual Base Fund to the program, which obviously has expanded our ability to do much larger projects. And this is an interesting time. In the mid-90s, the CWCB board was allowed to make loans up to $100,000. And as you all know now, we're allowed to make loans up to 10 million without going to the projects bill. So that really slowed projects down back then. And the reason that 100,000 was put in there, we had some borrowers that came in needing some emergency money, and our loan program couldn't respond quick enough. By the time it went through a projects bill, it was 1.5 years later before they ever got money out the door, and that was way past their emergency. So we asked for $100,000 allowance, and we were given that in the statute. And then I talked earlier about the late 90s, early 2000s. We went through that audit, and it created the policies that we use today. So moving into the early 2000s, you can see across the top, our ability to loan money without legislative approval increased significantly during the early 2000s. We went from 100,000 to 1 million to 5 million to 10 million as it still sits today. So in 2001, we were about 300 million in equity. In 2002, the General Assembly removed CWCB from the general fund, making us a self-supporting program. And so we don't rely on the general fund for any of our operations. It's all from the earnings through the interest in the loan program. 2006, we were about half of what we are now. And we did a loan to Aurora for 75 million back in 2007, which was a big number. I think at that point, the closest to that was about a $30 million loan to the Ute Water Conservancy District. So in 2009, we got hit by a general fund transfer, which is similar to what we're dealing with now. The budget was a problem, and the General Assembly swept $170 million out of the Construction and Severance Tax Perpetual Base Fund. We added restricted reservoir interest rate reduction in 2011, and we reached about 900 million in 2014 in fund equity. As you know, the governor approved the water plan in 2015, and oops, sorry, these are out of order. We added the grant program in 2017, and in 2020, we had our new largest loan package of 90 million for the Ark Valley conduit and a $10 million grant. And right now, the interest rates they've continue to come down, and I cannot imagine they get any lower. Our ag rate, I think, coming up for the next round of loans in November is going to be like 1.15% for a 30-year loan. It seems like they've stabilized and are no longer going down, but it seems like about the time I say that, they go down. So don't put that in the bank. All right, so first item, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, is the projects bill from last year. It is in the documentation that I had distributed to you all. is a large bill for us. I think that might be the largest we've ever had funding-wise. A considerable portion of that is that $100 million package to the Ark Valley Conduit. But we had some other significant items in there. The water loss initiative, we added another $1 million to that, and $4 million for watershed restoration. And then last year's water plan grants at $7.5 million. I'm not sure why I've got $110 million for the Ark Valley Conduit. That's an inaccurate statement. But you can see good bipartisan representation for the projects bill. I always feel like it's a good bill for Colorado. So it's good to see that. These are the by the numbers. You've seen this on occasion. I think I made a change from what I distributed to you all in your packet, and I changed primarily this average severance tax revenue for the last 5 years. We were up around 40 million on average, and Carly may touch on this as well. The severance tax is always a topic when it comes to water funding. Because of the last couple years, that average has dropped from 40 million down to 30 million. And I try to use about a 5-year window to calculate that. And that's important to me because if I try to project from a budgeting standpoint using that volatile up and down that severance tax has, I really can't. It's like you can't even budget anything with that variability. So I've relied on just a 5-year average, and it seems to work out better. And you can see that $40 million is our average P&I. That's up from last year. We've had a considerable number of loans go into substantial completion, which put them into repayment. And so I've raised that up to 40 million. But you can see these are just kind of a large picture look at what you all are managing. So we always talk about severance tax every year. And the pie chart more than anything is my focus here. And I think some of these numbers on the right-hand side under operational fund may need to be tweaked. I didn't touch them, but in essence, the red part of that pie is the loan program, the perpetual base loan fund. And then the green is the Department of Natural Resource operational fund that's really taken a hit through this through the last year. And again, Carly will probably talk more about that. Our programs, the two revolving loan programs, the big buckets, construction fund and severance tax, federal mineral lease comes into the construction fund. And then also the interest earnings out of that fund. 25%, that red part of the pie, comes into this perpetual base fund. That's 25% of that pie chart comes into that perpetual base fund, again, for loans. And then the severance tax operational fund is that other quarter piece of the pie. 25% of the tax revenues go into that. And that ultimately, for CWCB's purposes, that's where we would take out those operational grants that the board heard in March of this year that we ended up having to retract because of the collapse of the revenues into the severance tax operational fund. And then the other one is the Tier 2 money that goes into WSRF and Species Conservation Trust Fund over here on the right side. Projections for severance tax. Carly might go into deeper conversation on this, but this is how I look at this, the volatility. As I indicated, I use this $30 million average for the last 5 years. And again, it's dropped quite a bit from when we were using these taller towers. Across the bottom, you can see the years, millions of dollars on the left. And so again, this is 25% of the total pie up in the upper corner. So this would be the red part of the pie, which is also equal to what the green is. But this is money that comes into the perpetual base fund. This is the money that the board loans out of that fund. And we turn this volatile annual revenue stream into a consistent earning through our loan program. And I put in here for reference the projections for 2021 and 2022 fiscal year, and you can see just the magnitude of those two amounts on the pie chart, and that's what's making it difficult to manage that the operational fund. So This is a graph that I will update on occasion, and it just shows the difference between the revenue coming in from federal mineral lease. So the red is severance tax, and the blue and green are federal mineral lease and the interest earnings on our fund. And so we, again, take the red in every year and turn it into interest earning, either through the Treasury as it waits to go out the door for projects, or it becomes a repayment interest rate. And so those are the steady returns that we see each year, and they will continue to go up because the volume of money that we have available goes up. Unfortunately, the interest rates that we're earning are kind of causing that to flatline a little bit right now. Federal mineral lease has come down, although it's fairly steady. You can see we were up around 16, 17 million back in 2014. It declined considerably, but it's been running about that $9 to $10 million range since. This is the budget spreadsheet that supports what I bring to the board at each board meeting. This is our long-term model as we look to see whether we can fund water plan grants and how much is expected to the funds to produce over the course of this year and then future years based on projections from severance tax, federal mineral lease, interest earnings, and then the expenses that we see. So this is the investment side of this to see where we are. I don't need to get into this too deep other than to show you this highlighted 33 million is the TABOR emergency reserve that we have set aside in the event it's needed. And it seems more and more like that's going to be necessary to tap into that. So we reserve that so that we don't loan it out, make promises that we can't keep if that is taken. And you can see the 5 million up at the top. That's the severance tax revenue projection for this fiscal year. We do receive a new projection here in a week or under a week that may change that. Carly may talk about that as well. So for the projects bill, I want to reference the policy that we use. I included it in your packet, and it's I think it's policy. I should know this off the top of my head. Anyway, it's in your packet. I wanted to show you where you can find those policies if you're ever needing them. If you go to our website under public information, you'll find policies, and then these are all listed in there. Or you can call us up and we can grab it for you as well. So now we'll talk about how much money we have available for non-reimbursables. And it has become more complex with the transfer of the 45 million out of severance tax last session for the budget, and then now with that $33 million set aside for potential emergency response. The way we manage the amount of money available for non-reimbursables, and so may share it this way. I always look at the two funds as kind of a retirement fund. So if we were to dip into the principal of that fund, we obviously take away our ability to earn money and keep up with inflation. And so in this case, we want to always spend, or non-reimbursable money, we want to spend money that allows us to maintain the same buying power for construction that we have enjoyed in the past. And so my goal is to always stay on this anywhere from 3 to 3.25% construction inflation line. And obviously, if we lose $33 million out of the construction fund and 45 million out of severance tax perpetual base, we would never be able to do non-reimbursables. I should say never. It would take us 15, 20 years to catch up with that. So what I've had to do is say this board has control over what they make available for non-reimbursement. We can't control what the General Assembly does. And so I have shifted these calculations, assuming that we never had that money. Obviously, we're earning interest on those until that money leaves the account. But I've in essence had to say we never had that, so that I can at least show a similar approach to the available funds for non-reimbursable investments. And so those lines indicate where we need to be. And you can see at the top of this, and this is really more schematic than anything, there's just a little bit left over for non-reimbursables this year based on that calculation. if we were to just use the construction fund, we're actually not where we need to be in order to meet that policy. And again, it's a policy that the board controls. Here are the numbers that create the available funding for non-reimbursable investments. And again, I'm showing that we've already removed 45.5 million that was taken for the state budget last session, and then the 33 million, even though it's still in our account, I've considered it gone in the event it is gone. And so these are the numbers. I use 5-year average at 3.05%. So you can see the construction fund in 2015 was 407 million. Currently, it's 459 million. And I need to point out that these are funds that are available for investment. This is not, if you were to look in the fund, there's actually money in there that is dedicated to previous non-reimbursable investments. I don't consider that. It's available to grow the fund while it's there, but I don't consider that long-term investment money. And so as we look at these are taking into consideration that the board has already extracted money for previous non-reimbursable activities, and they can go back as far as, I don't know, 5, 10 years. Previous boards have authorized grants for a certain purpose, and maybe they're still waiting to be used. And you can find that information in the director's report. Lauren Miramont prepares that and summarizes all of the projects and their status. And so I don't include that in this growth calculation because I consider that ultimately to be spent. So extracting all that, this is the investment potential of the two funds. 2015, it was 407 million. In 2020, it was about 460 million. And so I have a calculation at 3.05% for 5 years. We needed to be at 473 million. So that's a deficit of about 14 million. Putting the severance tax perpetual base fund into that same calculation, it shows an excess of 20.6 for a delta of $6.7 million available for this board's consideration for non-reimbursable investments. And I will share at this point that when we were going through the budget process and working with Carly on severance tax issues, it was about the end of that time frame that folks were starting to apply for non-reimbursable investments that go into the projects bill, which was an August 1st application date. And the message that we portrayed, and I still think it's a valid message, that let's figure out a way to carry over funds the best we can, look at minimizing expenses, hoping that maybe we can make what's current or what has already been provided in non-reimbursable money maybe last 2 years instead of just a single year. And so we squeezed a lot of those requests down, and we'll talk about those when we get to the non-reimbursable item on the agenda. So with that, questions. And I found this picture when I was pulling out those timelines. It's one of my favorite slides for questions. And by the way, I'm not going to share with the board which basin this picture was taken from, but I know it wasn't in Iowa. They wouldn't do that in Iowa. So are there any questions?
Kirk, maybe a little off topic, but I was wondering about the status of the Arkansas conduit. Are they moving ahead with that, or where is it?
Good question. So we actually had some communication recently with Jim Broderick, and maybe Greg could share more knowledge on some of the status, but they continue to move forward. I haven't heard any major hiccups. I think right now they're working on some contractual relationships with the Pueblo Board of Waterworks because they're utilizing Pueblo's system to avoid having to put a pipeline in all the way through town or around the city of Pueblo. And so all those details, I think, are coming into play now. But it is my understanding that the Bureau is all systems go on the design to, I think, the community of Boone, if I remember right, is kind of that first step in getting water through the community of Pueblo, and then one segment of about 12 miles of pipe, and some of the treatment activities that are necessary to, I guess, convert the I don't know if it's convert chlorine in the water. Greg, do you have? I'm going to mess that up, but
yeah, I think they're using something called chloramine. Maybe
there you go.
It's a different chemical, and yeah, we have to remove that at a certain station, I think, and then they will retreat the water out at more of the delivery points along the way. And I think some of the complexity right now, and I don't want to string this out, but it's just that you got the Bureau that's sort of going to own the main pipeline, the conduit, and then you've got the district, I think, is going to own all these spur lines that go out to the various communities. And so working out the financing and the just all the agreements is complex. But to answer your basic question, Steve, we're definitely moving forward on this. I don't even think we ever anticipated gaining this much momentum so quickly, but between what CWCB did and what the federal government has done sort of in response, giving us, I think, 28 million this year. That's right. We are definitely getting after it. It's moved to the front of the line for our projects right now.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I will turn this over to Carly. Seeing none.
All right. Thanks, Kirk. Can everybody see what they need to see? Good. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Jacobs. I'm DNR's Chief Budget Officer, and I want to thank Kirk for the really nice introduction. When you are in state budgeting as a career, you get really used to people running in the opposite direction. So I'm really glad to be able to be here to talk to you today, just to provide a little bit of an update on the status of the state budget and how this broader situation ties into a few specific areas of interest for DNR and CWCB. And like Kirk mentioned, I'll be spending a bit of time on severance tax. So please feel free to flag me down with any questions you may have along the way, and we will dive right in. Let's see. So I think it's really important to establish right off the bat that the key characteristic of essentially everything that's going on right now with the budget is uncertainty. So uncertainty is the name of the game. We've definitely been able to see over the past 6 or 7 months that COVID's had a dramatic impact on the economy and by extension, our state budget. And it's important to know that we expect that to last for multiple fiscal years. Previous recessions have lasted 3 to 4 years before we've sort of pulled out of it. I don't think anyone expects this to be any different. So we expect to see budget impacts several years down the road. But it's really difficult to anticipate exactly how things will develop as we move forward. So, a lot depends on the status of the pandemic, the trajectory of the recovery, whether federal funds are available, how social distancing is implemented. All of those different factors can have a profound impact on the eventual outcome. We get used to saying that I don't know a lot these days, but that's kind of the environment that we're in. As Kirk mentioned, I also just want to sort of provide a disclaimer that there's a new forecast that's coming out in 2-3 days on Friday. These numbers that I talk about today will inevitably shift and change at that point. But I think overall the scope and scale of what we're talking about should generally be kind of in the right neighborhood. So I know that you had a really great update from Lauren Riss during your last meeting about the state budget, and that was based on the June 2020 forecast, which is the same one that we're still using. So hopefully I'm not retreading too much ground that you've already covered, but just as a quick refresher, in some of the larger conversations about the state budget, they're really focused on the general fund. So I just pulled this table or this chart from the 2020 Ledge Council forecast. And as you can see, the 3 blue bars on the right side show the impact to the state's general fund revenue. So in fiscal year 20, we saw a dramatic drop off in the fourth quarter related to the COVID shutdowns. In fiscal year 21, that deficit deepens, and there is some rebound showing in fiscal year 22. But the state economist cautions, or the Ledge Council chief economist cautions that that's really contingent on a strong rebound in activity. But any way you slice it, we aren't back to pre-crisis levels. So we're still about $1 billion short in fiscal year 22 at this point. It's not on here, but the general expectation is that this sort of environment and challenge is going to continue into 23. So like I said, this is going to be a multi-year situation. We'll get our first cut fiscal year 23 in the forecast on Friday. So that'll be an interesting new data point to see. There hasn't been much of an update past June 2020. Ledge Council did issue a report in August showing some improvement among economic indicators of business and consumer activities. But generally speaking, economic activity continues to be depressed below pre-pandemic levels, particularly in leisure and hospitality. And of course, as Kirk alluded to, the oil and gas industry is continuing to struggle with low prices and depressed production from the demand hit from COVID, and also a supply shock that occurred a little bit earlier when Russia and Saudi Arabia had a price dispute. So, we'll get updates on these as we go along, but future progress is really affected by those unknowns that we talked about. So all of this manifests itself in the state budget in a few different ways. And the first and probably most obvious is just a significant multi-year general fund shortfall compared to what we would have in expenditures. So in fiscal year 21 that we just started, there was a $3.3 billion revenue shortfall that the legislature had to balance to. And, rough numbers, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.8 billion to 2 billion is expected in fiscal year 22, although of course that's informed by the forecast. And I know that 1.8 billion certainly sounds and feels better than 3.3 billion. It is still a B with $1 billion in terms of shortfall. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the legislature used a lot of one-time options to address that 3.3 billion shortfall. For example, cash fund transfers, right? Once that revenue's out, they can't reuse it to address the shortfall in the next year. And they also used a considerable amount of federal aid to balance the budget. So it's not looking, those one-time options are one-time, so we don't have them in the toolbox anymore to address that, fiscal year 22 shortfall. And, the federal aid situation is pretty unclear right now whether any more of that will be available. So in many ways, the smaller number, the 1.8 billion, is a tougher nut to crack than the 3.3 billion, just because of sort of the more limited options that we have to address it. And so ultimately what this means is that there's very little general fund to go around. And I know that Kirk pointed out that CWCB is essentially cash funded, with the exception of a few recent items. But, it's important to know that there's no general fund backstop. So there's very little general fund to go around to help current programs that get into trouble, or fund new initiatives. So we're bracing for a really challenging budget cycle in fiscal year 22 as that process gets rolling. Another way this shows up again is cash fund transfers to the general fund. So they transfer cash out of these funds to offset some of the shortfall in the general fund. In total, between fiscal year 20 and 21, during the last session, there was 517 million transferred. Of that amount, 45.5 came from the perpetual base fund. So there was that significant transfer that I know that you're well aware of. I think we can expect the use of that tool, or at least the evaluation of cash funds again in the fiscal year 22 budget cycle. The other two pieces that actually, let me stop there. So unless there are any questions, I'll just kind of charge right along here. The next The next two items that I have are related to the TABOR emergency reserve, which Kirk pointed out, the 33 million that he was talking about a little bit earlier. And then I'll spend a little bit more time getting into the weeds on SevTax, mostly because I can't help myself. But hopefully it'll be a useful primer for you. So to start with the TABOR emergency reserve spending, the TABOR emergency reserve is a constitutionally required state reserve that's comprised of a mix of cash assets, so cash funds, liquid cash, and capital assets, so buildings, which of course would have to be liquidated if they became necessary. But those funds are supposed to be available to be spent during a declared emergency only. So they're not for a budget crisis, but they are available for use during a declared emergency. And we are in one, frankly. Of the cash portion of that, right, the table just shows the current configuration of the cash part of that reserve. And you can see that the CWCB Construction Fund contributes 33 million to that balance. So that's what Kirk was noting. We've previously had several cash funds in the reserve, which has included the perpetual base fund in the past, but for the current year, we're just looking at the construction fund in the reserve. So we did have disaster emergency declarations issued and ongoing for COVID and numerous recent wildfires. And I just got these numbers today, but about $176 million in state emergency spending has occurred to date. It's largely been out of the Disaster Emergency Fund, which was that first fund on the list, and a tiny bit out of the Controlled Maintenance Trust Fund, which was the second one. So they have not spent down to the CWCB Construction Fund yet, but we are obligated to keep that money available in case it's needed. And estimates, between the wildfires and between COVID spending, there's a wide range of possible expectations for what might be needed. So we do have to be prepared and be ready to account for that money in the reserve. Okay, my favorite, severance tax. Any questions before we proceed on that stuff? Great. So the roller coasters are important because that basically describes the status of severance tax as we know it. And as Kirk mentioned, this is essentially the same graph that Kirk put up. Kirk's goes back a little farther. But severance tax is a volatile revenue stream under normal circumstances. So normal, whatever those may be for severance tax. But this is just actual revenue back to 2008. And severance tax revenue goes up or down, changes in some way by plus or minus 80% from year to year. And that's average. So it either goes up or goes down by 80% from the previous year. And oftentimes, as you can see, much more. So when we talk about severance tax, about 95% of severance tax revenue is generated by oil and gas. So when we talk about severance tax, we sort of are automatically talking mostly about oil and gas. And on this particular slide, you can see the daily crude oil price, West Texas Intermediate. And there is some inherent volatility in severance tax that just comes from being associated with a volatile commodity market. But it's also important to know that the structural features of how severance tax is assessed, particularly in terms of credits and exemptions, really take what you're seeing there and amplify it. So it makes the highs higher and the lows lower, which just adds a whole other layer on top of the commodity volatility that we're dealing with. Now, you may notice a pronounced little situation off to the right-hand side of that chart. The last little bit right here, right there, shows the price collapse associated with those shocks to the oil market that occurred this spring. So, so there was, as you can see, oil prices even went negative for a day. So there was a profound impact between the demand and the supply hits to oil price, and we are starting to see the impact of that in production as well. So let me just show you how this changed expectations for severance tax revenue. I'm finding emails from back in February, and boy, that was a good world to live in back in February. This chart has a bar for each forecast. So each bar represents a past forecast starting with December, which is blue. So you can see that the blue bars in September for fiscal year 2021 and 22 look pretty good. But by the time we get to March, which is red, and again, the update in May, which is green, there's a considerable difference between the severance tax outlook that we were expecting in December and what we're now expecting going forward. So the purple bar is the June forecast, which is the most recent one that we're currently working from. Of course, that will change Friday. But let me just isolate that. So here's what we're looking at in terms of the June forecast. So as Kirk pointed out, we're only expecting 20 million or so-ish in statewide revenue collections. That's the second lowest severance tax year in my bar chart. And then looking at Kirk's, it looks like the second lowest severance tax year in a long stretch. So that's very, very low revenue collections. And just to illustrate how this flows through to severance tax cash funds, I just wanted to take a quick step back. Kirk had this in pie chart version. I have this in flowchart version. But as you can see, state severance tax collections are split 50-50 between DOLA and DNR. And then when we get our half of that, we split that equally between the severance tax operational fund and the perpetual base fund. So when you apply that projected revenue, this is how it shakes out. So 20 million in statewide collections, half to DNR means 10 million, and then half of that to each fund is 5 and 5. So that just kind of shows you how this trickles down through the severance tax distribution formula. So $5 million each in fiscal year 21 for the perpetual base fund and the operational fund. So on the perpetual base fund side, Kirk illustrated that lower severance tax revenue means essentially less revenue available for water projects loans out of the perpetual base fund. The operational fund side is a little bit more complicated. So the operational fund allocates revenue according to statute in a priority order between two groups of programs. So the first priority group is the core programs, which essentially support permanent staff and ongoing operations in DNR divisions. And you can see that the Colorado Water Conservation Board has an allocation of 1.3 million in that core program tier. Again, those are the severance tax grants that Kirk was mentioning. And then we have the grant programs. So these include things like the Species Conservation Trust Fund, a Water Supply Reserve Fund. I know you're all very familiar with those types of programs. And these programs can receive, according to statute, up to $36.3 million in total distributions if enough revenue is available. So when you put core programs and grant programs together, it adds up to about 53.8 million in potential spending obligations out of the operational fund between core and grant programs. So that's a pretty sizable tab. And I want to show how severance tax revenue kind of flows through the fund. And I promise I put this together well before the invitation. This is from an old presentation. So I'm not trying to earn any favors by using a water diagram, but it's pretty effective when you think about how the revenue kind of spills over into each particular tier. So as revenue comes into the fund, it first funds core programs in that first bucket. Then it spills over into a core program reserve. We're required to keep 100% of core program appropriations in reserve. And then once that bucket's full, once we've met that reserve requirement, what's left over is proportionally allocated out to those grant programs for whatever's left. And we're doing that now in arrears. So we let severance tax revenue accumulate in the fund during 1 year. We get to the end of the year, look at what's there, and then determine how that flows through the formula in one lump sum. So when we think about this, we have potentially 53.8 million in obligations And in fiscal year 21, we're expecting at the end, all said and done, 5 million in revenue. So that math just doesn't look very pretty. And the way we sort of understand the impacts of that is to kind of work our way back up through that formula. So first, there's no funding for the grant programs. And we're not expecting any severance tax transfers out to grant programs through at least fiscal year 23 and possibly fiscal year 24. Because you recall that all of those buckets have to fill up first before it gets to the last one. So there's no revenue available for grant program transfers. I'm also going to have to withdraw roughly $13 million from the core program reserve that we sort of accumulated last year in order to support fiscal year 21 spending. So I'm going to draw down that reserve bucket as well in fiscal year 21. And then when all is said and done at the end of the year, there's just not very much money projected to be left in the fund in fiscal year 21 or fiscal year 22. So there's ongoing cash flow concerns for core programs, making sure that we've got enough money to support spending into the next fiscal year, and accounting for the fact that severance tax revenue doesn't arrive in our fund all in one chunk on July 1st. It would be great if it did, but it doesn't. As a matter of fact, we get most severance tax revenue in April because severance taxpayers have the same tax filing deadline as we all do. So we see about 25% of our revenue actually come in close to the end of the fiscal year in April. So needless to say, managing the operational fund in the current circumstances is a really difficult proposition. So we've implemented a few things in response to the situation. The first one, again, just as a general sort of management point, is that grant programs like the Water Supply Reserve Fund and Species Conservation Trust Fund have to be prepared to manage for an extended period of time without additional revenue. And if I can reference back to the first part of my presentation, this means severance tax and otherwise. So, Kirk talked about non-reimbursable expenditures from the water funds. There's very little general fund that would be available to be transferred to these programs, most likely. Some of the fixes that we've used to kind of cobble together continuous funding for these programs in the past just simply aren't there this time. So the fund balances that we have are the fund balances that we have to work with for the next couple of years. Also, there was a distribution to grant program cash funds in August. So, fiscal year 20 was chugging along, in line with expectations. And those big shocks didn't happen until late enough in the fiscal year that, it didn't, the impacts to revenue sort of didn't happen for a couple of months in the revenue stream. So fiscal year 20 revenue came in as expected. And when we waterfalled that revenue through those buckets, there was enough for a distribution in August. However, DNR has also restricted the transfers to the cash funds that we administer from use, and those are going to be held in reserve until further notice, pending an assessment of the stability of the operational fund overall. So we're sort of treating those funds as if they weren't transferred. They're restricted and we can't use them. So for planning purposes, it's wise to consider that although we got transfers in August, they may not be available for use. Lastly, we've implemented some pretty aggressive core program spending restrictions to ensure that every dollar that goes out the door from the operational fund is an essential dollar, a critical dollar, just as a way to conserve fund balance to make sure that we can support our employees in critical operations. A quick note on the Species Conservation Trust Fund grant program in particular. There was a $1.5 million appropriated for species conservation during the 2020 session, of which about $750,000 was for CWCB. And the Species Conservation Trust Fund, like other grant programs, got a distribution of about $2 million in August 2020, as required by statute. This amount is restricted just like every other grant program cash fund. So when you take a look at the Species Conservation Trust Fund and you exclude those restricted funds the working fund balance to be managed over the next couple of fiscal years is 2.1 million. So I just wanted to follow up with a specific update there. And then to close out, I just wanted to provide, this is sort of unrelated, but a quick update on Prop DD revenue. So there wasn't much in the way of sports happening this spring, but man, we bet like crazy on table tennis. That was the most popular sport to bet on once all this got kicked off. And the Department of Revenue is reporting that they took in $952,000 in sports betting revenue in the last couple months of fiscal year 20 between fees and tax revenue and interest. So the tricky part about this is that the Department of Revenue also got a general fund appropriation to help set up their program before there was any cash revenue coming in the door. And the provisions of statute require that they repay the general fund for that appropriation. So they still have to do that. And as a result, there won't be any distribution in the current fiscal year. But they distribute Prop DD revenue in much the same way that we distribute grant program severance tax revenue, in that they'll see what revenue comes in the door throughout the course of fiscal year 21 over the course of the year. They'll take stock at the end of the year and then distribute any revenue by that formula in fiscal year 22, which includes the water plan implementation cash fund at the very end. So some signs of hope for Prop DD revenue, although a little bit farther out in terms of when that revenue is expected to show up. And Kirk, I am also from Iowa, and I agree that that picture on your slide was not from Iowa. But at this point, I'm more than happy to take any questions, talk through any technical issues or anything that you might want to go over. So I'm all yours. Did I make you feel so sad that you can't ask anything? Yeah, sure.
I'm just curious, Carly, in more general terms, has there ever been any effort to try and smooth out the roller coaster? I mean, this is an extreme situation, but it's not the first time. Have they ever looked at doing some sort of averaging or floating it, over a period of time?
Yeah, so that's been a perennial discussion, because just the volatility in a normal situation is really difficult to manage, particularly for the grant programs, which is where that kind of balancing happens. We've done the best we can from an expenditure side, or, there's been a lot of work on the expenditure side, keeping the reserves and trying to hedge against sort of these fluctuations of revenue into the fund. But the fundamental volatility of severance tax is really just related to how it's set up. So there's a bunch of different ways that other states handle it. For example, you could put in a trust fund and earn the interest, or you may want to take a look at your sort of tax credits that are driving that extra volatility. And those are really big picture questions that I know the legislature has been grappling with for a long time. I know there's been numerous working groups. So it's definitely, it's a big question, and it's an interesting question. It's also a really hard question. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
I'll just sort of pipe in. And
sure.
It is a very frustrating conversation. And even going back to my tenure, approving that prairie loan back with Aurora in 2007, I think Kirk can remember those conversations. But when we look at severance tax, why we haven't found some sort of financial instrument we could hedge our bets about, that's not been the choice of the state to do that. I think there are ways. Other states, if we were smart, like Wyoming and New Mexico, we would have actually a real severance tax account where we could live off several $1 billion worth of earnings. But we don't have anything to show for our severance tax because we put so little aside, and actually created one fund for higher education buildings. Well, that was swept in that last recession. So I think that it is frustrating. One mechanism I think could be helpful is if we chose to tax gas differently than oil reserves or generation. Maybe that might prove to have a different amount of revenue to the state, but that conversation's fallen on deaf ears as well. So I think that as a state long-term, we give that DOLA 50% back. We're one of the few states that actually give the severance back to communities. That's been our choice to reinvest that way. But we don't have any mechanism to put aside funds for future generations, and we're paying the price. We just have been riding that roller coaster and without any real fix to it for, you can see what length of time, for how many years we've been collecting it. So it is unfortunate, and I think we are really victims of our own bad choices. So I think that if we looked at different tax rates, that might be an opportunity, but we're looking at oil and gas production. How long is that going to be depressed over time? So maybe now is the time to look at some of those fixes. That's just my opinion, having looked at, wow, what's the foundation to these issues? So Carly, I don't know if you have any comments about those.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a big ongoing conversation and just a really sticky issue. But yeah, no, you're right.
Carly, I wanted to ask you about the Prop DD, because this is really the first time this board has kind of dove into that conversation. So if I lay out kind of a timeline, because we work in this annual, this board meets every 2 months, and then we go through this annual cycle. So if you're saying that the first time revenues will be realized by this board for water plan grant spending would be 2022, and I think you indicated maybe even midway through 2022, which would be, let's just put a date on it, January 1, 2023. Right?
Not quite. So let me just lay that out again. So they had 1.5 months or so of sports betting in fiscal year 20. So there's not enough revenue per the repayment formula and all that good stuff to make any distributions in the current year, which is fiscal year 21. So what's going to happen with that is now we're in fiscal year 21. So they're going to start earning sports betting revenue, right, all the way through fiscal year 21. And then they're going to take a look back at the end of the fiscal year, look at that distribution formula, and distribute fiscal year 21 revenue sometime, in the early to mid fiscal year 22. So it's just like severance tax. They let the money accumulate in their cash fund, and then they get to the end of the year, they make an assessment, and then they make a distribution. So 21 revenue goes out in 22, 22 revenue goes out in 23. And this is all, contingent on there being enough revenue to flow through that formula for Prop DD.
I think maybe where I was off by a year. So mid fiscal year 2022 would be about January 1, 2022. If I just throw out a number, and I'm trying to, again, kind of program the board and staff to think when we would then start laying out when those authorizations for project grants would occur. So it's sometime after that, obviously.
Kirk, you're about 10 months ahead of us there. I think the Department of Revenue, based on what I can tell, is still sort of working out exactly when they expect to make those disbursements. So I guess my slide and this discussion is really more just a general plan or pattern, but we'll get some more information from them on when exactly they think they'll have the numbers and all that stuff as that's moving forward. So I guess I don't have like a specific
and I think the best
target for you right now. But that's kind of the general gist of how that revenue is going to flow through when it starts to happen.
I think the best message is probably that that's not the answer in the immediate future to our problems with funding water projects, is I think where I want to go with that.
That's probably, we won't see the first distribution we won't see the first potential distribution until sometime in the first half of fiscal year 22. So it is a longer stretch of time, particularly with that repayment provision included that they have to cover first. So,
Kirk, to follow up on the question, when we look at the projects bill for the next projects bill, which is going to be the 2021 bill, that's going to cover expenditures in 2022.
Correct.
And so at what point, knowing that there's a potential authorization, do we include potential authorization in the project bill for expending Prop DD funding?
So it strikes me that the first time to appropriate available revenue would be in the 2022 session. But I think we may be getting down a rabbit hole on a general comment about the schedule versus maybe what actually will happen and when we can make those plans. So Kirk, of course, I'll defer to you on that, but I certainly didn't mean to open a scheduling can of worms, just kind of provide some context on when that money seems to be headed for the cash fund. So I think that's a decision. The scheduling is a decision sort of we can make as we learn more about how that money's going to come in over the next year and what that kind of looks like.
But given the overall financial crunch, shouldn't the CWCB have a pretty tight plan for expenditure of that so it's not used elsewhere?
I would assume so. I think between now and this conversation next year, a lot of this stuff will probably start developing as well. I think there's, again, a lot of uncertainties as we start laying out a timeline, not only for this board to put it in a projects bill for what to spend it on, but then also how to disperse it into approvals for water plan grants. I think more than anything, I just wanted to emphasize, I think there's a lot of response out there in the market that, Prop DD money is going to show up because it's in the news that, everybody's going out gambling right now, so there must be a bunch of money showing up. It just doesn't happen that quick. And so maybe the answer is it's possibly a project bill item in 2022, but maybe more likely in 2023, kind of depending on where we are.
Yeah, if any of you know my predecessor, Bill Levine, he's a big football fan, and so every time I talk to him, I'm like, "Are you doing your part for water bill? Are you placing your bet?" So yeah, I'm happy to provide an update. I think the Department of Revenue is just getting started on just getting all this put together. But I'm happy to provide an update as we get more information on that. Absolutely.
And hey, Carly, this is Lauren. I guess I just wanted to check my understanding too that you're hopeful that revenue is going to be able to provide us like monthly or quarterly updates. It's not going to be like it's going to be a black hole and then all of a sudden there'll be some communication along the way about what we can expect.
Yes. So my understanding is that once they're fully staffed up and have sort of everything sorted out, that they'll start doing either monthly or quarterly updates. And I, of course, am happy to make sure that I'm in touch with them frequently too in the interim so that we'll have some idea of how this is all going to go. So it's just a pretty new process, given that they just kind of got fired up in May. So, right. But yeah, absolutely. Very committed to providing any updates I have. Okay. Usually I see a few tears at this point in my presentations. So thank you again very much for having me. And if you have any budget concerns or questions, you should always feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to address them, especially as things keep changing as we go along. So thanks very much.
Carly, I can't thank you enough for not just this presentation, but your work throughout the budget session. We're just one of several that you have to deal with and asking questions and wanting immediate answers. And you've stayed strong throughout that. So I want to tell you how much I appreciate all the hard work that you've put into getting us to this point. So thank you.
Oh, Kirk, it's my pleasure. So thanks, but I do appreciate that. I am the bearer of bad news more often than not these days. So really appreciate that. Thanks.
Okay, Anna, I think you're up if we're good to move on to the next topic.
Yeah, I will share my screen. And you stole what I was just about to say, which was I can't tell you how much I appreciate Carly and all her work to help us protect our funds and all she does for us. She's got a tough job. So I'm going to go over this fairly quickly because Carly covered things so comprehensively. And this is really more or less a recap of a lot of the information that Lauren presented at our July meeting. So I'm going to quickly go over just really the fund balances, and then I'm going to tag team with Russ Sands, and he's going to talk more in detail about the WSRF funds, and then transition over into the criteria and guidelines conversation on that front. And so I don't think I need to spend a whole lot of time here based on all the information that Carly shared. Whoops, my slides don't, too far forward. There we go. So the current fiscal year, we had some funds redirected. We've got the TABOR reserve that's still part of our obligation, a little bit less than it was last year. The good news is we did have some money added to a few of our programs. Those are the ones that are supported by the construction fund. And then we talked through just with Carly there, the fact that there are not distributions to any of the severance tax programs. And we're all thrilled to know that the loan program is still open for business and operational. So that's the good news for the current fiscal year. Oops, I keep jumping my slides too fast. So then looking forward to next fiscal year, as you're well aware, severance tax is highly unlikely. Looking forward to any additional construction fund programs into our grant programs is very unlikely, I think, based on all the things that we just heard. We're thrilled that the loan program can stay operational. And then, like Carly said, the sports betting side of thing is all still to be determined. So we'll just stay tuned on that. So looking at the fund balances, this again built off the memo that Lauren also shared, but I have the actual numbers in here for you all. So our severance tax operational grants, current fiscal year, we don't have any funds available. Those would have been the grants that you all approved back last March. We are not contracting those this year. Looking forward, we won't be taking applications in January, so there won't be another round of those in the next year. WSRF, this table here, it's also in your memo if you need to see those numbers more clearly. This shows the current balances as of today. And so you all have some decisions to make at this board meeting. So once those decisions are made, then obviously these numbers will shift slightly based on that information. The other severance tax supported programs are the water efficiency grant program. So currently that balance is just under $600,000. So looking at trying to do that 3-year spending plan that we talked about in July. So we're looking at about $200,000 a year for those grants. So we can keep it alive, but it's definitely going to be significantly reduced. I think in a normal year, they do a little over 500,000. So it will be definitely an impact to that program. The Interbasin Compact Committee balance right now is about 1.2 million. The good news on this particular fund is that looking back over recent years, average spending from that is about $250,000 to $300,000 a year. So we can still support all of those meetings for a good 3-4 years. Obviously, we'll monitor that balance. I think also there, we'll see reduced spending this year, just in light of the fact that we are all meeting just like this via Zoom, and there's a lot less travel, there's less meeting space expenses, less food. So all those things will mean we'll probably spend that one down a little bit more slowly than usual. So that one should be okay. And then I'm going to flip to the construction fund supported programs. So the water plant grant program, we added $7.5 million through the projects bill. So that brings our balance up to $16 million. Something to note within that is that does have a lot of that general fund money that we'll have to spend by June 30th, 2022. So we'll kind of just monitor that internally on our spending there, but that's the balance there. So a little over $5 million per year is what will be available going forward if we stretch that over 3 years. And we typically do around $7.5 million is what we've been doing for these first 3 years of the program. So it's an impact, but not as dramatic maybe as some of the other programs that we've seen. The Watershed Restoration Grant Program, that program had $4 million added through this project's bill. So with the carryover balance that was already in the fund, we've got a little over or just under $5.5 million. So looking back at the history of that one, it looks like the average awards from that are about $80,000 or so. So we can stretch that out pretty well. That's still a lot of grants per year. So that one should be, okay. Certainly we're going to feel an impact to all of these really. And then the ATM grant program, that one did not have any carryover balance. So that $750,000 is really just that new money from the most recent projects bill. So it'll be an impact there too. A couple grants per year, I think, based on their average. I think they're about $170,000 per year was the average spending. So it'll be maybe one or two grants if we kind of do the same size grants that have been done in recent years. So that will be the impact to that program, but about, I don't know, a couple $100,000, or actually, yeah, $250,000 per year for the next 3 years, looking at that. So those are the balances. I'm certainly happy to answer questions if you've got those. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Russ so that he can go ahead and get into the weeds on the WSRF funds and those criterion guidelines. I don't see questions. I'm going to stop share. So Russ, you can share yours.
Okay, everybody. Thanks for being here. Russ Sands, CWCB for the record. I am going to probably just tee things up and just think the flow of it might work a little bit better to dig into the WSRF criterion guideline changes that we're proposing and then kind of end on some of the deposits and the impacts. And then Anna, I may ping you to tee up some of that carryover discussion as a kind of building on what we just talked about. So let me just put this in presentation mode. Here we go. So I just wanted to note, and you've all read the memo, I'll just kind of cover the high points here, but we have not updated the criterion guideline for some years. Senate Bill 06179 kind of sets the rules for us establishing the criterion guidelines, and that being done with CWCB board in conjunction with, I think it says in consultation with IBCC. Traditionally, as we've done updates through the years, we've done that by having a committee typically convened of 3 IBCC members and 3 CWCB members. And that last convened around the 2016 updates. And then we reconvened in 2019, just kind of visioning a little bit about what changes might need to come. And that meeting happened in December. At the time, we had same members who I will kind of reference, but Jim Yon, Steve Anderson, Jackie Brown, Heather Dutton, and then on IBCC at the time was Steve Harris in the Southwest. And then also Aaron Citron, who's a gubernatorial appointee, Stan Kasier from the Colorado, and Joanne Fagan from the Gunnison. That group met in December of 2019, and we were kind of talking about meeting again early in the year, maybe February, maybe March, maybe April timeframe. The March board meeting came around, and we were looking at getting that meeting set, and then of course the pandemic hit, and we all transitioned, and a lot of things kind of got put on the back burner. And I think that in some ways that this conversation around criterion guideline changes may have been left there and could have been on the back burner for a little longer. But I'll talk to you about some kind of more immediate needs that seem to represent low-hanging fruit that we might want to think about changing. So when that group reconvened in December, there were some clear pieces of just initial thoughts or guidance that came out of that. It was to really streamline, simplify, and clarify the guidance, to get applicant feedback if we could. Maybe we would do a survey to identify opportunities. I talked to Heather Dutton recently, and she had noted it as identifying nuggets. I like that a lot. We might get some nuggets of things we hadn't even thought about. And to create a larger list of suggestions that we would want to bring back. We talked about some things that staff had been potentially considering and other things that had gotten brought up through the years. And so the idea was to come back with a bigger laundry list that might have some more substantive conversation. Because of the impacts from the pandemic and specifically to just, I think, honestly, workload and budget, I think it's fair to say that the board, roundtable, staff, and others are perhaps busier than ever. It doesn't feel like working harder is going to be the solution. A lot of us are putting in more time, and I've noted in several occasions for people have said that, you know, we've lost drive time, but it's only just so we can kind of click to the next Zoom meeting. And I think that's certainly true. So our days and in some cases tend to be these back-to-back meetings. So we have to be smarter about how we do things. And I've seen the roundtables really, and maybe some of this was some time in the making, but certainly some roundtables have looked to how can they streamline, how can they be more effective with their meetings. I think we've all heard that, for a long time probably, but certainly in the Zoom era, about having shorter meetings. So we've seen, and you've seen us make those changes, right? Just even to the water plan grant deadline changes, trying to streamline how we do things, make it more clear, less confusing, kind of just going to a one time a year, trying to just streamline and make it simple. Basins have also really been thinking about this, and at least 3 have really started to shift towards making their WSRF grant approval align with the months that we have the state, that there would be a state match going to the board, whether their WSRF grants have a state match or not. So they're just kind of saying, we're going to look at everything WSRF. Currently, that would be in the July and January timeframes. That's the deadlines preceding the September and March board meetings. And we're also seeing that budget's limited. And as you've heard a lot about today, it's going to be challenged for some time. So we've thought a lot about, well, are there some things that we could do that are more immediate that might help on all ends? And I would really emphasize help with customer service here, because as time is challenged, we certainly don't want things to slip. We've gotten pretty good feedback from the roundtables. I think I'll talk a little bit about here in a second of how we're doing. But we want to keep that, and we want to see if there are ways that we can even be better. So there's some things that, I'll talk about kind of 3 discrete actions and a couple of sub actions maybe in here. But one is just to clarify the language. That was a pretty clear ask from the committee. And I just going back through and reading it, and somewhat painful, but doing the word by word, there's just outdated terminology, some that's caused confusion. So when we made the switch to calling SWASI the analysis and technical update to the Colorado Water Plan, immediately the next grant cycle, people would say, well, there's this reference to SWASI. Am I referencing the tech update? And it just leads to needless questions and back and forth with applicants and staff. So there's just a lot of opportunity to clarify language, to add examples, to kind of say, this is still a statewide water supply initiative. It's also called these things. You could reference SWASI 2010 or the tech update. And then there's some lines, honestly, in there that read poorly and maybe never made a ton of sense that we wanted to clarify. Some of that around match funding, some of that just around, it seemed some back and forth of if a basin could, join together to apply for a grant, which they can, but the way it read didn't seem to make it that way in some sections. So we're just trying to generally clean up the language. This is all marked in the attachment that's in your memo, by the way. The second thing, and this I'll spend a little more time on, but we would like to look at moving up the deadline. So one thing that I'll note right now is, and I'm just going to pop this in here, but you can see where we've changed the water plan application deadline. So it's December 1 is the deadline for the March board meeting. So you have a full 3 months to review. Current deadline for WSRF for that same board meeting is February 1. And some staffing changes that we've made on the back end have really funneled all of those WSRF grants primarily to one person. And then that one person coordinates with other staff. And that one person on my team is Craig Gaboo. And Craig Gaboo, as of yesterday, no longer works for the state. He decided he was going to take a pretty abrupt and quick retirement. And so he made that happen effective 5 p.m. yesterday. So now this is especially prescient, I think, just because, again, we don't want anything to slip and we would like to have the time. So as an alternate, I will propose that we could look at just matching the water plan deadline. So if we wanted to allow 3-month window instead of a 2-month window, this is an option that the finance committee and the board could consider, is that we just push that back. I think it has the benefit, certainly with the water plan grants, to align with the same deadline date. And we could further, if we wanted to, add in a line that may accompany in the criterion guidelines that says, if the WSRF grant is leveraging a water plan grant, then those need to go to the board at this, during the December deadline for the March meeting. That might help clarify this awkwardness that I think kind of got pointed out. And I remember Director Hawkins bringing this up at one of the previous meetings when we approved a WSRF grant that had this match for water plan, but water plan hadn't been reviewed yet. And what would that look like if one failed? we have those missteps. I think they're, to be totally fair, and Kirk Russell brought this up the other day, and I know Craig has said this too, sometimes applicants are applying for a grant and they may not realize that they could do this leveraging or have thought that way, and so it could develop. But I will say that on the back end, it kind of has the same effect, because we approve one grant, it doesn't go under contract until the other one's approved anyway, and so you're still waiting. So it may not actually cause any additional delay for the applicant. It just kind of is maybe a perceived delay, but either way, we are kind of holding everything until they're all approved and then doing the contract making. I will say that we, in addition to meeting with the committee, who maybe it's important to note, we ran all these changes through. This new one of if we went to a 2-month or to a 3-month instead of a 2-month was not something we discussed there. It's something that's kind of come up in the last couple of weeks, given these changes that have come to light, and maybe there being some opportunity there. And then also just kind of recalling some of the board's comments around wanting to see the grants all at once, that maybe that's an additional opportunity. So all the other changes that we're talking about today are something that the committee of the 3 board members, well, technically 4 board members and 3 IBCC members, kind of were all in unanimous agreement of. We also sent a survey out to the chairs and asked them to distribute those to the roundtables. This actually needs to be updated. In 2 weeks, we actually heard from 16 applicants. We got great feedback that I think we did find maybe some of those nuggets just in digging through some of the open comments. And of the 16 the 16 respondents, 13 of 16 had little concern over deadline changes. So that's 81%. I will note there was only one person that said that they were just flat out concerned. They also had marked that they did, over 10 WSRF grants, but that same basin, somebody else noted they did over 10 WSRF grants, and they had no concerns. So I don't know that the concerns are consistent. My guess is that it may be a sector-specific concern potentially, but they didn't provide any additional feedback of what was driving that concern. And there's 2, if you wanted to count the 15, you actually get to a higher number. There was 2 additional people that marked somewhat concerned, but they understood the need to make a change. So it doesn't seem like there's a lot of concern. We did not in that survey ask if it was, pushed back a month or 2 months. To be fair, we just said if it was moved back, would you have a concern? And again, we had a pretty high response rate that it was not a major issue for them. If you want to see it, here's the response. I could have just flipped there instead of explaining it, but this is how it breaks down. So again, you had that one comment that came back as concerned. And the last concept I'll leave you with, and then Anna, when I get through this slide, I may ask you just to tee up that carryover conversation and tie it back before I dig in. But the third concept is just, if we're going to be making these changes, you all just heard how tight budget will be. If there were additional money to come in, it would likely be very, very small, certainly in the near term, or if at all. And this 40-30-30 distribution seems kind of weird, especially as you're dividing up dollars. It seems like a huge waste of time. It would be much more efficient if there's anything to deposit into accounts to just do that once. The other weird thing about this 40-30-30 split is that money is never really there July 1. And so it's led to questions of, hey, was that deposit made? and no, it hasn't been in many cases. In fact, it can sometimes lag pretty substantially, such as in this fiscal year. So by making this a one-time deposit and making it September 1, that aligns nicely with the board's finance committee. It seems to kind of reduce some of that confusion of when things would be deposited and add some clarity there. So that's the kind of the last of these 3 buckets of changes that we're putting forward. And I will tell you how we might get to this, what the distribution might look like. But Anna, do you want to talk a little bit about carryover first?
Sure. And I guess I hadn't really prepared a whole lot of thoughts on this. So, but just generally, so the board's aware, on all of those balances that I shared previously, that was sort of, what was approved in previous projects bills. Maybe not everything was either awarded or contracted, or projects get approved and they don't move forward. So those were those carryover balances for those other programs. What's different about WSRF, and this was not in that table yet, is that there was $2 million from I guess it was 2 years ago, the projects bill appropriated construction fund dollars to go towards WSRF. And then what happened was, I think the actual severance tax revenue came in higher than we were initially thinking. So we held that back to some extent to say, let's wait and see where things go. And so we do have another $2 million that is available to be put into the WSRF program now. And so we were looking at what Russ has here, proposing that we make that distribution just one time for the basin funds, and we'll do it per the normal equation. And Russ, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. Is it 64% goes to the statewide?
Yep. Here's how that breaks out.
Oh,
yeah.
that's
No, I knew you would do the tee up more eloquently than I. So I appreciate that. But yes,
you've got
that
the
was
actual
perfect.
math. I'll let you talk. Perfect.
No, that was perfect. Yeah. So for the basins, exactly. So this is maybe if there is a spot of good news in here. I know a lot of the basins are adjusting to this kind of new reality of really being, extra judicious. I think when you ask them, I remember saying, hey, we really need to be smart with our money. And they said, hey, we're always smart with our money. But I think it's a new level set of reality here. So this carryover dollars has the effect of the $2 million, the 36% that goes to the basin accounts divided by the 9 basins effectively ends up at $80,000 per basin. So with this change that we would be making, we would effectively be just making that deposit in one lump sum for each basin pretty much after the board would approve this, or as quickly as we can make that happen. The remainder, so the kind of the additional 1.2A, the 64% that goes to the statewide account would then be deposited. And what that does is it would effectively, and this is just kind of rounded numbers. I've got a hidden slide if you really want to dig into some of the math we can, but it basically brings the statewide balance up from the 5.7 million to 7 million. It makes the 3-year spending, if we're kind of spreading that out, go from about 1.9 million a year to 2.3 million a year. And that is effectively equivalent to what was spent, roughly last year, but that also happens to be about the same number. It's slightly higher than the median over the last 4 years of spending. So I know this was a question that Director Hawkins had asked us, is what does this 3-year spend kind of look like? And so basically this additional funding takes us from what would have been about 20% under what the statewide match could normally be, roughly to about equal of what it would be. So it's really helpful on the statewide matching side. And I think definitely going to be appreciated by basins. However, and I think that we've all kind of taken to this is, given the gravity of what you just heard today, we have to just reinforce for the basins that this may be the only money that they're going to see for some time. So, some basins, obviously you're going to see a whole bunch of grants come through this cycle. Hopefully they are their strongest grants, but increasingly they're just going to have to be judicious with the money that they have left. And I think, that's my last one.
I had a question about this. I have a general question about whether we're going to talk about flexibility on matching funds, but I do note here that if each basin gets 80,000 per basin, do we have enough to leverage up the basin funds to meet the statewide funds? Or are we going to create a problem where roundtables can't approve statewide fund requests because there isn't enough in the basin funds if they're also funding basin projects?
That's a good question. I guess I hadn't thought about it that way. There's probably is a point you might reach that, but I'm not sure that we're there yet. I mean, I guess it all depends on where you're trying to back in the math out of and how much additional funds you can bring to bear. But we tried to specifically, with Anna and Kirk's input, really clean up that language about the basin match to make it less murky. But the way that it effectively reads is that 10% of the ask that you're making has to come from the statewide account. And the rest could be made up from any combination of in-kind, third-party funds, wherever you can bring the money in. So it really allows the basins to leverage quite a bit of money with a pretty low threshold for entry. So Director Hawkins, it's a great question, and the answer is probably at some point that would happen, but it doesn't seem like it's on the horizon right now. And that is my last slide. If there's, we can take other questions as they come.
All right, I guess if we want to end that topic, we are on to Laura and Rissa's work plan presentation.
Russ, and thank you, Kirk. I was just thinking, I'm sorry if I missed it, Russ, but this is going to be an action item in front of the board during the regular meeting. So this is just a prelude to that, a preview.
Yeah, and maybe an exact prelude. So I apologize that you'll get the same presentation twice. I didn't know what the proper procedure is for what, if any, decisions could be made in Finance Committee. But if there was a direction that this group thought the 3 months, for example, made more sense, we could pare back the presentation. Otherwise, you'll get the same information and can have that conversation publicly.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to try and share my. Oh.
I'm sorry, Lauren. This is Steve. I would make a comment. I see some merit in the 3 months. You know, that's got to reduce the load on the staff, one, and the money's going to arrive basically at the same time. So I certainly like that idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I would add that I think that many times one of the, there's an immediate problem of just, this kind of staffing and wanting to, do better, have more time just to marry up. With the 3 months, I think allows us to do what is another thing. And this was highlighted in some of the survey feedback too, but sometimes we just get held up on the back end. I was having a conversation, Director Felt, with the Arkansas the other day, and they just talked about how they weren't under contract for one grant when another one had been approved at the same time and what was going on. And it's just the issue that we run into where the PMs aren't always involved on the front end. So I would be hopeful that with additional time on the front end, we can do a better job of trying to reach out, engage PMs on the front end to make any changes they want on that front side, so that when something goes to the board and it's approved, we can immediately move to contracting instead of having that kind of additional back and forth. So I think in some ways, maybe we're just shifting the time and honestly being more transparent by allowing 3 months as well. But I'll throw that in just for consideration.
This is Jackie. I like the 3 months too. I think that it takes a lot of the waiting, even though I agree with what you're saying, that it puts it on the front end. I think it could overall make the process go more smoothly. So I'm not sure. I mean, the fact that we're not taking action today, I don't know that we need to go through the whole presentation unless the other directors need to. Is there something we can straw poll or something we can do to kind of find out if we can move forward?
I would agree. I don't know that we need to see it twice unless there's some input that you would like from us in advance of that public presentation.
I'm certainly okay with shorter meetings as well.
I would just question, maybe the public may not necessarily be tuned in to this finance work session. So I think that having that information in full transparency put out for the record, I think that some portion of the presentation needs to be going forward for tomorrow's meeting.
Well, thank you for the input. I will do my best to just try to, if there's anything I can kind of naturally pare out that kind of keeps the main content so we can streamline it, then that sounds like the direction we'll take. And for example, I may just cut out the 2 month and switch to the 3 month if that kind of seems like direction to go. And I can just acknowledge that that was a discussion that we had here.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank you.
Okay, are we ready to move on to agenda item 4? I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I feel like I'm never as good at this as everybody else. Can you guys see my slides? Yes, perfect. Okay. Slideshow. Okay. So this is a good follow-on, I think, to the discussion that we just had in many ways. I'm not going to reiterate all of the reasons and rationale that Russ really just covered, I think, for why it makes sense now to kind of tighten up our processes and how we do things with all of our grant programs. As you'll recall, we had a broader discussion about this a year ago in Finance Committee, just kind of thinking through how we can be more efficient with our time. And based on that conversation, and then just the chaos that this year has really become with the COVID situation, we thought it made sense to present this information in the form of a work plan to get your buy-in for how we as staff might go about doing this in a really efficient way, to come to you at a later, in subsequent board meetings, with recommendations for how we can actually tighten up some of our grant programs. So I won't go through the memo and the work plan that's in your packet, but I'll just pull out just the high level points here about the goals and kind of the strategies for how we're suggesting we accomplish this. I think, overall, I think what we collectively agree on is that all of our grant programs should be aligned with the water plan. And, because of the fact that our grant programs tend to be developed as we get the funding appropriated, kind of as independent grant programs and independent grant criteria and guidelines and the associated approvals and requirements with those. To my knowledge, we really haven't taken the opportunity to look across the board at everything that the CWCB has as far as grant programs go, and to make sure that they all really are aligned and integrated with the water plan. And Anna's going to talk later about the grant and loan portal and the fact that we're going through the water plan update right now. It really feels like now is a good time to take that survey across all of our grant programs and to make sure that there really is that alignment. The other overarching goal here is that we have consistency, and this feeds right into the grant and loan portal, that our grant programs, the application process, the staff review and approval process is all consistent, and that each grant program really meets a clear and distinct need for the funding that we're providing. And I think now more than ever, that is hard to argue when we are seeing our funding resources stretched thin, and there's just a lot of eyes on what we're doing. It makes sense to just be really targeted for how we're using our funding. And then, of course, that the board, as well as the staff, the board's approval process is really efficient and transparent. So in light of those goals, what we are proposing to do is basically, across all of our grant programs, compare a variety of different information, including the approval process and timeline, where the funding is authorized, whether that's by statute or board policy, where the funding comes from, stats about the average grant size and grant award, the number of applications that are considered by the board, and then really take a deep dive into each of the different grant programs and look at the criteria and guidelines and see how those are consistent or not with regard to match requirements, how it ties back to the water plan and the basin implementation plans, and then the whole review process. We're proposing to also reach out to other state agencies that have that also have grant programs. CDPHE, for example, the State Forest Service has a grant program, GOCO, DOLA, and see if we can maybe incorporate some of their best practices into how we approach the grant process. And then we're proposing to present this information, both the analysis, the comparing and contrasting of our grant programs, and making recommendations to the board over the course of 3 board meetings. And I think this is a pretty aggressive schedule, to be honest, and is going to require a little bit of a lift from the grant managers across the agency. But I feel pretty strongly that unless we tie ourselves to deadlines here, that there are going to be other things that come up and are going to take our time. And I think we just need to buckle down and do it. And I think, as I said, that really now is the right time to take a hard look at this. So we're proposing on basically breaking our grant programs down according to a couple of different topic areas, and then presenting that information to you according to that topic area. So in November, we would present this information that we've gathered for grant programs that deal with planning, studies and analyses, and then drought. And then in January, we would basically tackle the more substantive, specific grant programs related to the water plan, watershed restoration, agriculture, and the Fish and Wildlife and Healthy Rivers grant programs. And then in March, we would provide recommendations to the board based on your feedback that we've gathered through those other board conversations, and hopefully come out with some ways to streamline how we're doing things. This is really kind of where I wanted to get board feedback. If you have any, if you've had a chance to think about this after reading the memo, kind of the topic areas where we would propose to make recommendations. What we've come up with is, based on the analysis, and obviously we haven't done it yet, so there may be things that come to light during this process, but areas where we might suggest combining or streamlining our grant program areas where they may be redundant and could benefit from restructuring or combining grant programs, amending criterion guidelines, and then streamlining deadlines and providing some reasonable lead-in time prior to board meetings that would allow staff to really do our due diligence and work through statements of work on the front end and working with roundtables. And then, of course, the board review and approval process. So that is, I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So that is, that's an overview of where we're thinking and how this would go, but really eager to hear any thoughts that you have, any information you would like to see if you're supportive of this effort, and especially other topic areas that you'd like to hear potentially staff recommendations on. Director Dutton.
Lauren, thanks for this presentation and update. And I just weigh in that I think this is a great idea. And as we talked about, I think at our last year's finance committee, and then also at that special workshop that we had, I think that was in Steamboat at Water Congress. Mm-hmm. Just, the fact that a lot of these programs have come together over the years, even the Washington program being an example, but over the years, we've had these different programs added with different rules and different criteria. And, and it was just a couple, that's fine. But now that there are so many, it's just, I think this is just smart, and it makes sense not only for us to be able to understand what it is that each of these programs do, but really to make the best use of your time and to allow the agency to be, more nimble and probably more effective with our funding, to have things streamlined and kind of more organized or consolidated. So I'd say I fully support this proposal.
Great, thank you. I think you're on mute, Director Schwartz. There you go.
I would ask that we have a little historic data. How long the grant program's been in effect, how many grant applications, funding over the years. Just let's maybe order of magnitude understand how competitive the programs are. It'll help us prioritize them, I think, in some regard. Just whatever kind of historic data criteria you can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
This is Jackie. I just want to say that I really support this. I do remember the meeting in Steamboat, and I think it's hugely important for all the reasons that Heather just mentioned. And I don't have the same concerns about, seeing the data of the programs, having been through the processes in the roundtable and sat through these grant recommendations as a CWCB board member now. I think it's clear that that there's some changes that need to be made, and I really like the way that you're proposing to go about it. So, I would hate to put too much additional work on staff. Maybe, Gail, I guess I'm not really sure what you mean by historic data, what more that staff can provide to help the decision, but certainly if you feel that you need to see that, that's great. I think this is really going to make it easier for applicants across the state to understand where their project fits in, if it fits in, and really understand, how they move through the cog wheels here to have a successful project at the end. So I really appreciate the time you've put into it already.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. I think that's a good question. I've sort of readily available information. I think as we look at the board review and approval process, we have to actually prioritize what things we still want to have oversight over and approval over, and what things we can let go of. So just kind of gross numbers, how long it's been in existence, how competitive it is, what kind of dollars are associated with it. Those are just kind of fundamental pieces of data that would help my decision making. But
I think we can do that. Yeah. We may not be able to do it, for the whole history of every grant program, but I think we could do something, with over the last 3 years or something. Yeah.
Lauren, I agree. I really support doing this work and appreciate the follow-up. The only thing that I would add is if there's anything that we should be considering in the short term as we deal with the funding crunch that we've talked about today, I realize that there could be things like, reduction in match requirements that would be more temporary that we should consider. And I'd be really interested in seeing if there's any way we can, stretch things over the next few years, get people the money that we can.
So you're talking about reducing the match requirement, not from the state, but for applicants.
Yeah, or if there's anything we should be considering doing that is more temporary in nature to get us through the next couple of years where things are going to be really tight versus sort of longer term programmatic changes that are recommended. I'd be interested to know if there's a difference between the two as you guys evaluate the programs.
Okay, yeah, we'll keep that in mind. As we were thinking about kind of what schedule we should propose to you in doing this, I think that really is one of the reasons why we decided to move pretty aggressively, because we could easily stretch this out over a year, but then we're talking about not making any real meaningful changes while we're really in a kind of a crisis mode and need to make changes sooner than later. So we'll definitely keep that in mind. And if something comes up, we can even propose recommendations kind of along the way. If we see something in the first round of reviews that we think would really benefit from a change, we can make that recommendation to you in November.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Kirk, I'm going to defer to you. I do have a staff recommendation for the Finance Committee, but I guess I don't want to do something that's out of the ordinary for how you typically do things. So I'll just note that, my recommendation was that the Finance Committee approve this work plan, and so that we would move forward according to this schedule and incorporating your feedback from this discussion. And based on that, you can expect to hear from us again in November. But Kirk, if there's something more formal that you typically do in these, I honestly just can't remember.
No, as long as it's not money related, most of the stuff that we've done in the past is direct tie to authorizing money. So no, I think you're good.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all.
Okay, we're going to move into the next agenda item, which, if I'm keeping track correctly, we're going to talk about the actual non-reimbursables, the ones that will become projects bill related, which means I need to share a screen. Geez, then I lost you all.
Hey, Kirk?
Yeah.
Could you just mean, maybe you're going to do this anyway, but I keep hearing non-reimbursable, and I'm thinking of different meanings for it at different times. I wonder if you could just really clarify. I mean, is that just something that's you don't have to pay back, or?
You know, we throw around terms so much. I appreciate the question. So it kind of goes back to the history of where we have been. And when this program first started, everything was paid back. Everything was reimbursable. It was a loan program. And then as things evolved, we generated revenue from that in excess of what I guess it was deemed adequate to continue the program. And then we got pulled out of the general fund for funding. And again, the accounts grew and we had an opportunity to do non-reimbursables. And so the idea is we have money that we invest, and those we're investing in the loans, the water project loans, or it sits in the treasury and generates the revenue. Then there are those that do not come back. And again, it's probably just the history, but the term non-reimbursable investment, for the most part, has been those items that are either in statute or in the projects bill. The board has an opportunity to approve grants from previously submitted non-reimbursables in a projects bill passed. And so it can get really confusing, and really the term grant would line up with non-reimbursable, but it was authorized by the legislature, appropriated by the legislature back in the day, and it became now available for grants at a board meeting that you all approve. But I use it in this term as projects bill specific, as money not coming back to the board. So it's in essence severed from the investment opportunity that we have. So I don't know if that covers your question. We probably use it in many different ways, but think of it as money that's not loaned out, really. Not loaned out or invested in treasury. So this year's projects bill is going to be lean, assuming this is where the board goes with the recommendation from staff. And you can see on the screen, I wanted to start with the fact that we do have some automatic refresh items that I term them non-reimbursable. They just don't need to go into the projects bill because they're in statute. And that's the A, B, C, D, and E. The one missing at this point in time is the WECO funding, that $150,000 funding that was in actually it wasn't in statute now that I say that, but it was similar in that it was an automatic funding opportunity for this board. So I listed those items, and this is kind of how I keep track of where we are. So I don't have a column number, I apologize, but you see where it says statute/bill amount. As an example, the Wild and Scenic Fund, it has a refresh number of $400,000. So the CWCB staff, Linda's group, manages that fund right now, and she will be spending out of that fund over the course of this fiscal year. So when we get to the end of this fiscal year, we determine how much has been spent or how much has been contracted, and we refresh that up. So at the start of the year, there's always 400,000. And it's the same on all those items listed in there. Those are statutorily refreshed, not projects bill, but yet they're investments that are not going to be reimbursed to the investment side of CWCB. And so I track those. In general, I try to look backwards to see how much we've typically spent out of those funds, try to estimate what we might spend this current year. It's all a guess. I think it's way too conservative to say that we're going to use the full $2.65 million this year, especially since we're kind of constricting spent expenses, just trying to realize that we would like to carry over more. We have the ability to spend using that Wild and Scenic Fund. We could spend the full $400,000, but we're trying to be conscious of the impact to the construction fund. So internally, we've tightened the belt on a lot of those programs. And that's why I put that estimated number over there at about half of those dollar amounts, with the exception of the Flood and Drought Response Fund. We anticipate that the need for that, due to the fires and maybe the impact from flood as a result of the fires might be there anyway. So I wanted to just assume worst case scenario, we'd spend the full 500,000 this year. So then I moved down to the list of projects bill applications. These are all, you've seen them before. I think all but number 3, the technical assistance, was actually in last year's projects bill. So 1, 2, 4, and 5 you approved last year, and I believe the dollar amounts, no, they're a little bit less. That's right, because we ask that folks take a look and see if we can spread some of their standard requests maybe over multiple years. And so let me go through these real quick. The number 1 with Kevin's name on it, the floodplain map modernization program, we are keeping that at 500,000 because it leverages so much federal money, and lowering that down, we lose federal money. So we decided to keep that at the full 500,000. The litigation fund, that one's a little bit unique in that we set aside, similar to the items up above, except it's not in statute. So we have to do this in the projects bill every year to say, we want to make sure they've got $2 million available for AG litigation work, protecting compact issues. The board hears the AG's recommendation for budgeting in May of each year. So you heard the presentation this last May, Amy Beatty's group. They said they needed about 1.5 million over the course of this current fiscal year. And so we get to, when this project's bill kicks in, we'll refresh that back up to $2 million regardless of the budget ask of the AGs. And there's just to leave some room in there for just in case. Item number 3, the technical assistance, that is one item that was in a projects bill passed a couple years ago. Alex has used that funding to leverage federal money. It is technical assistance work for grant applications and to really give Colorado a leg up when we're compared to other states in their efforts to secure that federal money. So it's money that's been used wisely, and it has the potential to go a long ways in securing additional federal money. Next item is the weather modification program and Andrew's efforts. Last year we increased that from 175 up to 350, and we really don't want to take a step backwards and reduce that. Again, it's leveraging a significant amount of money out of the lower basin, and so we felt leaving that up at 350 was wise. The satellite monitoring number 5 is a annual ask and a partnership with DWR and CWCB in this effort to modernize the satellite monitoring system. And we've asked DWR if they could get by with about half of what they've asked in the past. And they have submitted a request. They said they can get by with $100,000 this next fiscal year. And so when we add all that up, now, and I guess I should point out, in most of these cases where we've asked folks to squeeze a little bit, they've said, well, I hope this isn't the norm, and there's certainly no guarantees. But I know that last item, them dropping that to 100,000, it's going to have an impact. So we got to be careful not to set a precedence at some of these lower levels. So that total for all the projects bill non-reimbursable investment items plus the statute items is about 4.8 million. There's a pretty big guess on the items up there in that statute auto refresh level. But as a reference, I showed you the slide where I calculated to grow the fund to match construction inflation. It had about 6.7 million available, and there's some plus and minus in there. And then we're proposing 4.8 million here. So with that, that's pretty small projects bill, pretty significant swing from what would we have last year, $134 million down to 3.25 million in this year's projects bill. But again, we're trying to make a little bit go longer. So with that, I'll take any questions on this. Otherwise, we'll shift into this, the next item that I will ask Heather Dutton to assist me with. And I don't think I have everybody on my screen, so yell out if you want to talk about any of these items.
Hey, Kirk, this is Alex Funk, CWB staff. I just caught a quick sort of error on my part. So in your recommendation, it says 300,000 for TAPC. I think my memo says 200,000. I think I was using the template from last go around. The number is 300,000. Just want to clarify that and can work with the board to edit it if need be.
Very good. So 300 is the right number, correct?
I'll take whatever you can give me. 300,000 is what I put in for a request. Yes, thank you.
All right, I see Heather on, or Director Dutton on here. I'll lead into this this conversation. So it is not unusual for, again, the lead up time to projects sometimes gets a little clumsy, and for folks to understand, getting in front of this finance committee meeting for projects bill another 8 months down the road. It's not unusual for us to have some discussion at the finance committee meeting that are still in development as projects move through the process. And this is no different. Heather's going to talk about a project that was brought to my attention. And I've worked with Cleve Simpson at the Rio Grande Conservation District as well. And I know they've been working on this a lot. So Heather, I'm going to have you update the board where you are with this idea and the importance of this project to the Rio Grande.
Thanks, Kirk. And I actually, if you could, maybe I can just steal the screen from you. Oh, can you stop? I actually have some slides to maybe help out with this discussion.
Did you get rid of me yet?
Yeah, you're good. I'll see if I can be as fancy as everyone else. Okay. Does that look right? Is it just showing the one slide?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm excited to share with you all today about a project that we've been working on in the San Luis Valley for over a year now. And as Kirk said, we're still trying to work out the details, but we have enough traction that it's looking like it's actually going to happen and could be a pretty big deal. And I think to really explain and to provide the context for you all to see what a big deal this could be for us, I'm going to take it back a little bit, all the way back to just kind of a little bit of hydrology lesson in the San Luis Valley. And so obviously here we are, the Rio Grande Basin, that's where we are in the state. You guys probably didn't need that geography lesson, but got to start somewhere. I think a lot of people are familiar, but I think I also take for granted that we all know what's going on in each other's neck of the woods. And so just it's pretty important to know about the hydrology of the valley, to understand the significance of this project. There are two stacked aquifers in the San Luis Valley. There's a shallow aquifer, which is unconfined. It's easily recharged. It's anywhere from 30 to 120 feet deep, and it's recharged from rim flow, from river seepage, ditch and canal losses, actual physical recharge that people do on purpose. And then there's also losses through evapotranspiration and withdrawals from wells. We also have a deeper confined aquifer, and it is confined because it is separated from the unconfined and put under pressure by confining clay layers. And so that is blue because they are literally blue clay. It's kind of this beautiful clay that when you get wet, it turns into this lovely turquoise color. And so the confined aquifer it's deep, it's under pressure, it's artesian, and it's harder to recharge. It recharges in the rim areas. So around the edges of the valley, you can see on this depiction that you get the flows that come in at the edges past the clay layers. So hopefully that's a little bit of background so that when I talk about these two aquifers, you can kind of visualize what I'm talking about. So in the valley, there's a heavy reliance on groundwater use because, as in other areas in the state, our river is heavily overappropriated. It was actually fully appropriated in 1890. And so then people turned to groundwater use, especially after we started having to administer the river with the Rio Grande Compact in the 60s and 70s. And so there were already quite a few wells, but there was a real rush on putting in new wells in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So now there are about 5,000 irrigation wells in the valley, and of those, 3,600 are in the unconfined and about 1,400 are in the confined. So the result of that has been really mining of our groundwater, because while the surface water was regulated and administered according to the compact, we didn't have rules and regs for the aquifer actually until quite recently, although there was a moratorium in the 70s issued on new wells. And so people could still get well permits, but under pretty specific conditions. And so you can see we've had this, ups and downs, but this massive loss in this is the unconfined. It's the easier map or easier to graph to look at. But this incredible loss in flows or in water in our aquifers has led to the need for regulation and for well rules. And so the response from the community has been to set up groundwater management subdistricts. And so this map it's a little coarse, but it shows the different response functions as part of the model that the state put together for us, the Rio Grande Decision Support System, RGDSS. And it shows these different areas that have similar hydrologic responses. And this, I wanted to show this first because it's kind of zoomed out of the whole basin, just if you're not as familiar with our geography, but kind of zoomed in on those response functions, you can get this picture that we have. And I'm going to kind of trace them for Jim for the colors. So we have our Saguache subdistrict, our San Luis Creeks subdistrict. This area doesn't have a subdistrict because it's largely federally owned and there aren't a lot of wells over here. The Closed Basin subdistrict, which is primarily focused on the unconfined aquifer in the Closed Basin, and then the Rio Grande alluvium. So this one doesn't actually have requirements for sustainability because it's just focused on the Rio Grande alluvium, Alamosa Ligera, Conejos, and Trinchera. And Subdistrict 1, the Closed Basin Subdistrict, is really focused on unconfined issues, but the others are largely focused on sustainability of the confined aquifer. So all of that is important background in helping you understand the project. So what we've been working on for the last year and a half is an opportunity to purchase a pretty huge farm in the northern end of the San Luis Valley. And I hope you will forgive me that I'm going to remain a little bit vague and not name the farm and try to be kind of vague here, since we're still working out a purchase agreement and appraisal and everything with the current owner of the farm. But I can give you enough details that I think you can understand the flavor of the project. So this farm is in the north end of the valley. It's quite large. It's 5,400 acres. It is all under center pivot irrigation. And so it pumps an average of 10,000 acre feet from the confined aquifer annually, and it has no surface water rights. And so the impact of this operation is a incredible draw on our aquifer system with no input into the system. And so we would like to, as a community, purchase this farm and utilize a concept that this board actually funded a couple grants, and one of them, I think it was either a water plan or an ATM grant to Colorado Open Lands, to investigate the potential in doing a conservation easement where the values that we're trying to protect are the groundwater. And so we as a group have come a long way in this process and believe that it can work legally and have huge benefits to the community if we start putting easements on wells and farms in the valley that have restrictions on those wells for the benefit of a healthy aquifer. And so we're far enough down the road that we believe this will work, and that the ultimate result in the project would be to retire pumping of 10,000 acre feet from the confined. And so we believe this will have incredible benefits, not only for the agriculture community, but also for the environment in the valley and just for the community as a whole. And so, again, I said the farm's kind of in the north end of the valley. it's connected to, you can see how these streams all flow southeast. And so there's this series of really important wetlands and wildlife habitat that flows from Saguache Creek. There's Meshack Lakes in this area that's owned by the Nature Conservancy, down to the Baca National Wildlife Refuge, past the San Luis Lakes State Wildlife Area and the Great Sand Dunes National Park, and then towards the Blanca wetlands, and then over here is Russell Lakes. And so all of these important wetlands have a certain level of connectivity. Oh, sorry about that. And so while we can't, we don't believe we can accurately prove what the benefit would be, we're certain that there would be incredible benefits just for these underground and above ground wetlands, both the surface and the groundwater ecosystems, by taking 10,000 acre feet of pumping out of the equation. There will also be great benefits to the groundwater system. A way to really highlight what the scope of this project is, that if we can complete this project and remove 10,000 acre feet of pumping from the equation, that gets us halfway there to sustainability for the entire confined aquifer. So going back to that colorful map that I put up of all of the subdistricts that are working on confined issues, this single project could get us halfway there towards sustainability for all of those different subdistricts across the valley. And then if we're able to pull off a couple more big projects, we could potentially get to a place where the subdistricts aren't all trying to work on their own and purchase water and trying to piecemeal things, but this would be a larger community approach towards sustainability for the confined. We also, just with that community approach, it would go a long way towards supporting the community as a whole, because as you're aware, the San Luis Valley it's a primarily agriculture-driven economy, and so if we are unable to figure out aquifer sustainability and make the subdistricts work and figure this out by ourselves, it will require the state engineer to come in and start shutting off wells, and that will be a process that it won't work well for our community. It will put us into probably decades of legal battles. And so if we're able to come up with elegant solutions like this one, I think it's better. I know it's better for our community and our economies, both the towns and cities that rely on agriculture, but agriculture as a whole. And that's where I was visiting with Kirk this morning. And I know it's a little counterintuitive that a dry up project could actually be beneficial for agriculture. But in this specific instance where we live in a basin that is so oversubscribed, we have to find ways to balance our supply with what we're using. And this could help us do that. Some folks have been pretty curious about what we would do with the land. We are not sure yet, but we'd be open to any kind of opportunities. We're limited with solar because of transmission capabilities, but would still like to keep the door open to something like solar, or definitely revegetating the land to native cover and potentially having a grazing reserve. I think any of that is on the table, but what we're focused on now is just procuring the land and securing it within the water community and being able to focus on the pumping reductions. So that is it. Let me stop share. I hope that was helpful and maybe not too in the weeds, but I wanted to give you guys enough background to see why we're so excited about this project and why it could truly benefit the whole community.
Heather, can you touch a little bit on your timing of things? And maybe I missed it. If I did, I apologize, because I think that's based on some conversations. You're just kind of in this tough window of time with, if this board were to help with funding this, it needs to go in the projects bill and the timing of this whole thing.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. I did not touch on that because I go in the weeds so fast. I appreciate you bringing that back up. So the reason that we want to make sure to get this in the projects bill, but I don't have all the details for you right today, is because we are in the process of getting an appraisal. And so I anticipate that we will have at least draft numbers by the November meeting, but for sure final numbers in time for the January meeting, where the board usually approves or recommends the final projects bill. And so it is a fluid process where we're working to get those final numbers. But we also are kind of under a timeline, since it's taken us a while to just kind of get all the partners to the table and kind of coordinate the steps of this. We do have a limited window that if we waited until next year's projects bill, I'm not certain that this opportunity would still be available to us. So that's a little bit of the background on why it's kind of a placeholder today, and hopefully we'll have a lot more details in November.
Director Dutton, what would likely happen to this property if for some reason the project doesn't come together? Do you have a sense? Are there competing offers out there?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So right now there aren't competing offers because the owner has not, it's not on the market. He has come to the water community and said, look, he recognizes that this could be a really great thing for the community as a whole. And so if we can pull it off, he's making it available to us. But if we are unsuccessful, then he's been pretty clear that he would put it on the market. And there was interest from some hemp folks, but I know that market is kind of changing right now. It's used for a big alfalfa operation, and they ship all that hay and in the form of that water in the form of hay out of the valley to dairies. And so I think that would probably remain a possibility. And then, of course, a concern of mine is that if we are unsuccessful, then this could be a pretty large parcel that could be purchased as part of a water export scheme. So I think this project has incredible merit on its own, and that's why, I'm not hanging our hat on the opportunity for us to keep the water here. But there is that benefit that if we are able to secure this, that would make sure that water is retired and not available to leave the valley.
So thanks, Director Dutton. I was really struck. I know that they're not exactly the same, but there's some parallels to the demand management discussions we're having for the Colorado River Basin. So could you sort of walk us through, are there concerns about like the secondary economic impacts of essentially fallowing a ranch this big, or is there sort of across the board support in the water community for this because of the extreme sort of supply issues with both surface water and groundwater? Can you give us a little more in the weeds on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I also was thinking about the demand management parallel this morning too, and how it is this example of reducing consumptive use to make water available for the greater community and river basin. So it is interesting there. I'm sure there are people out in the woodwork who that I don't know who probably would oppose this because those people exist. But the neat thing about this project is that it has been something that has been tried for decades. My grandpa was actually part of a group of farmers that all put $1,000 in and tried to buy it in the 80s. And they weren't able to get it done. And so this has been a thorn in the water community side because it was one of the last set of wells that was drilled. And they really shouldn't, legally the state engineer couldn't deny permits because the water was there, but physically the water has never been there. And so these permits, they never should have been issued. The wells never should have been drilled. The fact that there's no surface water associated with it makes it a really contentious property. And then one of the sub-districts, I think on my slide, I noted how this would help. I focused on the greater community, but really specifically the sub-district that these wells are part of has been struggling because the majority of sub-district members view this single property as the reason that they are not sustainable because it has such a draw on the stream and on the aquifer. And so that sub-district has kind of struggled with why would they all work together to offset well depletions for this massive neighbor of theirs when their operations are being impacted by them. And so we have very clear understanding that if we are able to do this, that would mean the success for that part of that smaller community in the valley to come together and get that sub-district up and going. And so that's as local as it gets, breaking the community into these smaller hydrologic areas, and the fact that they are fully on board with this. And then we have all of the water conservancy and conservation districts in the valley working together and putting in funds, as well as our environmental community. And so I think that's a pretty good indicator of the broad support.
Yeah, and I noted, I think this is the best example I've seen come through in this particular type of discussion of a multi-purpose project. We don't tend to see projects that have this many benefits coming through for this kind of funding. So I noted that too.
Thanks.
I have a quick question, Heather. This is Curran.
Hey, Curran.
Hey, so would your district be the owner of the land parcel? And if not, who's going to own the conservation easement? Or would it be a partnership or something like that?
Yeah, that's something that I hope we'll have worked out by November. So it definitely wouldn't be my district, because we're smaller. Since there is the Rio Grande Water Conservation District covers the whole valley, where we only cover a portion. And so I don't see any scenario where my district would be the landowner forever. I think there is a potential that the Rio Grande Water Conservation District could end up with it, but we've already talked to state and federal agencies about the potential to somehow to donate it to them, or come up with some kind of land management agreement where maybe the Water Conservation District owns it, but some of our federal partners manage the revegetation and the grazing. And re-veg wasn't your question, but it just clicked for me. We recognize how important it would be to re-veg it. And so we probably wouldn't cease all pumping overnight, because we would need a certain amount of water to get the native vegetation going again. And so I have a range ecology degree, so I'm pretty excited about the re-veg program there. But yeah, that is a very wordy answer to we're not sure yet. Okay. That's one of the things that we want to work out, but it would be in this same spirit of how do we do it in a way that has the greatest community benefit.
Thanks.
So I have a couple questions, having been involved in the sub-districts from the get-go, but and also with COL. So the question is, the couple questions would be the conservation easement. And I like tying the water to the conservation easement, but also is the keeping the land in production, so to speak, with grazing, revegetation. But you also talked about, which would be consistent with conservation easements, but you also talked about the possibility of converting it to solar. So 2 questions about that and how that would fit with the conservation easement structure in the state now. And if that land, if you put in solar, will that land stay classified as agriculture from a tax standpoint? And can you put a conservation easement on it when it's going to be converted to this so-called industrial application with the solar? Questions?
Yeah, that's a super great question, Gail. Thanks for asking that, because I think that helps with clarity. So again, this goes back to that this would not be a typical conservation easement. It would not be to conserve the agriculture values or the upland above ground values. It would be a conservation easement for the benefit of a healthy aquifer. And so the value that would be conserved is what is the benefit to the aquifer of reducing pumping by 10,000 acre feet. And so it wouldn't be the traditional one where you do wetland mapping and habitat assessments and say, well, this is the value of having this, landscape in production agriculture, because we're going to dry it up. So it will not be production agriculture. Any kind of upland benefits that we could have from solar or from revegetation for habitat would be the goal, and it would be a positive externality of the project, but it would This is a new way of thinking about easements, and a different way of thinking about it is that we are talking, or Colorado Open Lands is talking with other producers about other ways of doing this type of easement, to where maybe they agree to pump half of what they have historically. And so if they've historically pumped, 300 acre feet on a quarter section, can they reduce that and get compensated for having the beneficial use be a healthy aquifer? So they get the benefit of that reduction in pumping, but then they still have the opportunity to keep farming. And so Open Lands has looked at different scenarios of kind of all or nothing and everything in between. And this would be an example of all, where we're saying, okay, this would be the maximum value of a conservation easement for a healthy aquifer, because we would be shutting it all down.
So my second question was the benefit to whatever county it's in, Swatch, whatever county it's in. If you did a solar application, is there a tax classification assessor from the assessor if you did something else with the land?
Yeah, I don't know about that yet. And so I know that with other properties that the Rio Grande Water Conservation District has purchased, they're still paying, they're still paying a certain amount of taxes as a recognition that would hit the tax base for these rural counties. Mm-hmm. And so since we don't know yet what would happen with the land, we do know that, it would stay in one piece, but we also know it won't have surface rights or groundwater rights associated with it. And so that's, I think, another great question that I can note down and try to have better defined in November.
Great, thanks.
I do think there are ways you can get creative with deed restrictions and land use provisions. I mean, I can think of a couple examples here in the city. There's one even where there's an easement that restricts a particular property's use to be a golf course, and that gives the city control over the property owner's ability to redevelop it into some other use. So yeah, it might be outside the sort of traditional framework that we think of when it comes to conservation easements, but doesn't mean you can't do it.
Yeah, you can join the team and help us figure that out, Jessica.
Heather, this is just such an awesome idea, and congratulations to your basin for, working on this and solving your own problems. I just never ceases to impress me what the San Luis Valley is willing to do for, to keep their livelihood, continuing for generations to come. And it's just such an original and amazing potential project. So thanks for telling us about it today.
Yeah, thank you guys for listening.
Hey, just to clarify, Heather or Kirk, what are the next steps that this project would go through with our board?
Yeah, so like I said, we're working on the appraisal, and so I think once we have those numbers, I anticipate having a meeting with all the partners, including Kirk, to kind of say, okay, now that we actually know what we're talking about, because right now we just have kind of what the owner is like, well, I'd like this much, and we're saying, well, we don't think it's worth that much, and as it goes. And so I anticipate then we would all sit down and say, okay, here's the plan, who can contribute what, and then here is where we would come back to the board with some specifics and say, this is what we would be requesting as a non-reimbursable. This is what we potentially would need as a loan. We're entertaining that we may need a loan to purchase it and then turn around and put a conservation easement on it, but we need to get it off the market. And so that's kind of all to be considered. And so hopefully we would have all those details on the exactly what we're asking for and the funds to bring back in November.
Yeah, I think it's just a timing issue, and we'll work with Heather on more details. the typical Director felt in the past, what we've done, there are usually a handful of non-reimbursables that have just a head nod, go forward and present it at the board as a block of approvals. And I think just based on what I've heard and what we've done in the past, we'll quickly move through those non-reimbursables, those 5 items. This certainly will come back for a much deeper discussion, whether it's in March, and maybe we want to have an update in March regardless. I apologize. I think they're vacuuming. They're putting new ceiling tiles in today. I picked the wrong day to be in here in the office. Anyway, so bottom line is we just needed to plant the seed for this idea. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done, but I guess I was interested more than anything to see if there was some support for the idea, and we'll work to move forward on a plan.
So, just a couple of thoughts as we think about next steps. I agree, it's a really creative project, and I'd love to see if there's a way that we can support it. I mean, it is sort of a great example of a ground up solution coming from the local community. And if there are ways that we as a board can facilitate that, that would be great. One thing to think about in terms of the appraisal, it might be helpful to have an appraisal for the value of that deed restriction or conservation easement, which may be a component, but may also be separate from kind of the surface property or the fee property itself. And one of the reasons I bring that up is as you think about, the future use of the property itself, separate and apart from the water right, there may hopefully be ways to derive benefit for the community and perhaps some economic benefit as well. And so recognizing that you're probably not going to have all the answers right away, what would happen if at some point down the road, the group is able to put that property to beneficial economic use? Would some of that money come back to the state, or how would that be used to kind of further the purposes of the project? So just a couple of things to think about as you go forward is kind of what's the right role, what's the right contribution from this board, and how might the future development of that property come back either to the local community or to the state.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that is part of the appraisal. Is we made sure that it's going to include the conservation easement, and so we're not just doing a basic market appraisal. It's the whole conservation easement proposal, or appraisal. So we would be able to say, well, this is the total value, and then this is the value of restricting the use of the land to not having that groundwater withdrawal. And so then I think anything outside that water aspect would not be appropriate for this board to potentially purchase, because I appreciate what you're saying, that we don't want to get a bunch of grants to buy something and then turn around and make a profit off of it. That's not fair. And so that will be part of what we bring back to you, so that you can see the full gamut of, well, these are what all the different things are valued at. And so how can we parse out? I think it's, especially appropriate if we could really parse out, well, this is the environmental benefit of the project. And that seems like a really great place for this board to contribute funding for, or this is the value of that restriction, and that totally ties with the goals of the water plan. And so that would be an appropriate investment from this board.
Okay, I think we'll close this discussion. Heather, great presentation. Good stuff. The last item on our agenda, Anna, I see her popped up here, is we're excited about this web portal. So Anna, you're on.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to share with you all a really quick video that our development team put together that highlights the work we're making on this loan and grant portal. This has been a long time coming. We started the RFP process, well over a year ago. And as many of you know, that process at the state can take a little bit of time. So through that process, we selected a company called Cyber, and they've got a tool that they call eGrams, which is their electronic grants administration and management system. And so this is really more of an off-the-shelf, customizable program. They work with states all across the country on putting together just online portals to accept funding applications. And so this route will hopefully help us move more quickly, and it was a lot more cost-effective than just building a tool entirely from scratch. So ultimately, where we want to get is that we will have all of our funding opportunities housed within this portal. So this should help as far as customer service goes, as far as a consistent location to find out about funding opportunities. Once they create an account, if they apply for additional projects, it'll save all that data for them. A huge part of this tool will be for us really on the reporting side and having all things housed within one common platform. And this kind of goes to Director Short's comment earlier about the history of these programs. A lot of our grant programs, we've got a database for some, we've got spreadsheets for others, and it's just not housed in one easy spot to report for our purposes. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about. And then it will also be a great document management tool for our project managers with things housed all together. So we started off tackling the water plan grant program first, because that kind of touches a lot of our different program areas. It's one of the more complicated programs that we have. Once that's finished, which should be in the next month or so, we're going to tackle the loan program. And then from there, we'll just roll out the rest of the grant programs. It should be, I think, a lot more straightforward once we get those two done. Those are the more complicated two. So from there, it'll generally be a copy of a program and modify a little bit, but we should get pretty close, I think. So what I'm going to do is just share my screen here. Oops. And play for you, if I can. There we go. This pre-recorded demonstration that they put together, and it's great. I appreciate that they did this for me. It goes a little bit quick in some spots and slower in others. So I'm just going to let this sort of play in the background. I'll talk through some of the highlights, and then I'll take some questions. And we might not go through the whole thing because I kind of got into the weeds with some details here that I'm not sure you all really care to see this long and late into the afternoon. But effectively, this is going to show all of the current grant applications that are available. And so right now, it just, again, shows the water plan grants. So that's where we've started. And from there, we'll have things available as far as, application deadlines. We can choose if we want to put how much funding is available for that round. That's, if we want to put that out there, we can. If we don't, that's not a big deal. There will be program information for each program, which I'm hoping helps with customer service as people kind of go through. I think folks often wonder, where should I apply? So this should help direct them to say, okay, if you fit this criteria, here's where you go. That just highlighted the criteria and guidelines. So I think this will tie in really well with the information that Lauren shared as far as our work plan as we're trying to sort of streamline criteria and guidelines. Hopefully, working through this and that program, we can make things simpler to our outside users. Another nice thing is that entities, once they register, it'll save their information. But if an entity has multiple users, so an organization might have multiple people applying for different programs or different project managers, you can have different users within one organization. So that should keep at least the data consistent. So all the back end as far as, the EFT and the W-9 and all the things that we collect every time, that will just stay housed and we'll keep that all consistent. This is kind of going through right here what the actual water plan grant will look like. This is really just a copy of our existing program. It has a checklist so that the applicant knows what all we're going to require. If they try to hit submit and they haven't submitted or included all the things that are required documents, they'll get a little notification saying, hey, you didn't fill in this section yet, please do that. So that should help us also making sure that we're receiving entirely complete applications. And then here it's just kind of showing we can upload maps. If we've got things like the feasibility studies, we can upload some large documents there. And then another nice part about this is that it will also have a communications log. So the applicant will be able to jump in here and see, okay, they've received it. It will also send out an automatic email once an application has been collected into the system. An email goes back out and says, hey, we've received that. Things like that right now are a manual process for us. So I think this is going to be a nice time saver on that end. And then equally, I think as important to me is sort of the back end, and that's going to be helping all of our program managers. So this will go through in a moment here, looking at, I think here just showing we can create PDFs and different things. So we'll be able to output information to you all quickly. But the review side of things, I think, is going to be really beneficial. And so once applications have been submitted and accepted by the program, we can assign review teams. Within those teams, they can collaborate, they can put in all of their scoring, they can add comments. You can go back, and if you're having commentary and you decide to adjust a score to rank one project higher than the other, that's all done within this. So it's going to create a little bit more consistency as far as how we evaluate different grants. And then we'll keep track of all of the approvals. So as staff recommends things for approval, that will be saved within here. And then once we get through board approval, we'll enter that information here too. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier, it's that communications log I think will be very beneficial for our staff too, and for the applicants, truthfully. But then post-award, we'll be able to do things like collect progress reports or collect those final reports. And even the invoicing process will be done through here. I know there's been a lot of questions from folks saying, you know, one project manager requires this, another one requires that. If we just all kind of work through the system, I think it's going to create some consistency that hopefully makes our customers happier. I think the other big part of this to me is the training side of things. So we have a few fairly lengthy trainings for our staff coming up later this month. And what I've talked to the developer about is I want to make sure that we've got some pretty comprehensive materials also for our water users. I know that change can be a little daunting sometimes, but I think once we get through this and people get used to this system, I really do think it's going to be a great time saver. Russ earlier mentioned the WSRF survey that went out and some of that feedback that was collected. As part of that survey, we did throw in a few questions about this portal because we wanted to, in part, just notify folks that, hey, be prepared. You know, this is something that we are working on. And we did get some good comments. And so I shared those with the developer on a few things. One of the comments was, you know, sometimes it's easier for us to do a budget in an Excel sheet rather than force it into a form in a platform. And so I think they're working on making that as an option for us. But generally, the feedback was really positive. People were interested in being able to save information and come back to it, which certainly this will allow us to do. They can get feedback within there. We can communicate between the project managers and the applicant. And if we need to refine things, that can happen within the portal. So I think all in all, I think it's going to be a great tool for us. So again, I don't need to let this play through the whole entire thing. I think you generally get the idea. It's kind of a goofy thing to walk through here, but I just want to let you know that it's underway, and stay tuned to some extent. We'll get there and hopefully roll it out in the next couple of months, and we're pretty excited about it. And I'll happily answer questions if you all have any. Looks like Director Schwartz. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So if someone's coming in, is there a way to enter sort of your profile and then it will direct you to a grant? If you're, let's say, an individual, private sector, does it direct you towards a grant program, or you have to have the background to know which grant program you're pursuing?
We're hoping to, and we haven't developed this yet, but we're hoping to have a few key questions on the front end that would potentially guide them there. To be honest, we haven't gotten to that level of detail yet, but that was one of the things that when we chose this developer, that was one of the features that we were looking for. So that is the goal.
Yeah, it is confusing for people to really know where they fit. And if they're not a water provider versus an individual, I think it's hard to decipher which program would be the most appropriate. So I hope there even be a way to kick you out if you don't fit certain criteria, if it's not going to direct you, so people don't waste their time. And then also identifying sort of the order of magnitude on what funding is available and matches. And I mean, it just is, we have so many programs. It's just hard for people to approach the process and know where to go.
Yep, I agree completely. And we're hoping that by having all of this housed in one spot, that also helps, right? That here's the list. And then if we can embed some front end questions to help direct better. Yep, you're exactly right. Looks like no more questions, but we're excited about this. Hopefully you are too. And we'll provide more information once we've got the final tool rolled out.
Thank you.
Good stuff, Anna. Thank you for all your hard work on that. So now we've come to the point in our agenda where it's open mic time. So if anybody has something they'd like to throw in here for Finance Committee, whether it's this one or a future one, if there's something that the board would like to see more of, less of, or help us help you.
So where's Bill Levine when it's open mic?
We love Carly, but Bill, yeah, he would bring some bigger humor into these ugly conversations.
I think just in general, I mean, obviously, given the budget situation we're in this year, what we're forecasting for next year, we're going to really have to think creatively about how best to use the limited resources we have to further the goals, of the various programs we administer. So I don't know if you have any guidance or thoughts for us, or strategic questions that you want us to be thinking about, recognizing that we aren't going to be able to dole money out as freely as we might want to.
And that's so tough in these projects from a funding standpoint. They take a while to develop to the point where they're requesting the money, doing the groundwork to get to a point where they've got a dollar amount in mind. And so to stop the train so quick like we did it's just tough on all sides. I do worry, and Jessica, your point is well taken. I think we're going to feel this more so a year from now, and maybe even 2 years. It's even going to feel tighter because we're going to start spending down those balances. The revenue is not going to come in any higher, and just looking at the way we project out non-reimbursable money available in the projects bill, it gets squeezed further and further. And so that question I had to Carly, I hadn't really thought about the timing of that, but unfortunately that money doesn't line up with this big rut that we're going in. So I agree with you. I think it's just going to get more and more challenging. And I have a feeling, my crystal ball says that I'm going to ask you next year to probably diverge from the policy the way it's written, because I don't think we're going to have any non-reimbursable money if we follow the policy next year. I think it's just we're just going to go below. And it's, it takes a while. We've been doing this for 15, 20 years, and we've been on that good slope. I think we're just going to have to take a chance and anticipate that it'll recover, and we'll invest in the future. So.
Well, speaking of policy, I'd like to put some time aside and see where the opportunities are with maybe without such a heavy reliance on severance tax. Are there other opportunities that we can explore? And I think that putting our heads together, obviously we have the gaming funds, but there are other opportunities. I just think we need to think about it, because we've kind of hit a dead end here, and it's going to take a while to recover. Are there some other funding avenues that we should be discussing?
Hey, Kirk, I just wanted to add in, I don't know if Russ is still on the line here, but in response to Jessica's question about just what can we do to make sure we're being strategic, I think the governor's wildly important goal in setting us up to have a project database working with the basins hand in hand to really flesh out the data and the costing information will really put us in a good spot a year from now to better make sure that we're using resources and funding projects that are really ready to go and are prioritized according to the basin's criteria. So I think the work that we're doing now will set us up to have a better conversation this time next year, I hope.
Lauren, I'm here. I totally agree.
Great.
I think one thing I would just say that really stuck with me today, it's pretty big picture that I think Carly brought it up, but that even though in our current year we had to cut probably twice as much money from the state budget as they're anticipating next year, the fact that a significant portion of that was these sort of one-time sweeps of money that they aren't there anymore, and then the extensive federal aid that can't go on forever, but it also doesn't seem like it's going on forever. It just really hits home that while we're struggling maybe with things that are lifestyle oriented as well as financial through the COVID stuff, even as we start to hopefully turn the corner on the epidemiological challenge, the economic challenge ahead almost sounds worse than what we've been through from a state government perspective anyway, just because of the lag time of recovery. And this was really helpful for me. It doesn't sound at all like the CWCB I discussed with Becky back in February, but I am excited or interested, challenged to help try to figure out, how we work our way through this. And I guess presumably the bi-monthly updates from Kirk will be adequate, but I feel totally open to doing 2 finance committees a year if it's necessary because of this dynamic situation.
Mm-hmm. And no jumping ship now, sorry.
Well, just last comment. We're tying our water future, ironically, to the fossil fuel industry. And so that's why I'm saying looking at another revenue source, because it's not where the funding is going to be long-term or the opportunity is going to be long-term. I think I think the irony is interesting.
Great comments. Anybody else? Otherwise, we get out of class early today.
Pretty much, yeah.
What time are we starting in the morning, teacher?
Well, that's a good question. I was focused on today. Oh, I see Russ George's face on the screen. Good to see you, Director George.
Thank you. Good meeting.
Looks like we're starting at 8:30 tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Sure wish we could go have a beer. That's the routine that I miss more than anything, just having a beer with you all. So I guess we'll just have to wait for that day.
Or some potatoes like we did last year this time.
Some potatoes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. All right, good stuff.
Right.
Well, thank you. All good. We'll see you guys tomorrow morning.
Bye. Good meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Great meeting.
Yeah, great. Good job.
Right.